Hello, welcome back, midnight listeners, to Black Screen Horror. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? And if the darkness is calling to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss what's hiding in the next black screen. Now turn off the lights, sink into the silence, because what's about to begin is real. Throughout my life, I have experienced a handful of different paranormal events, most of which were fairly mild and easy enough to shrug off over time. But there is one particular experience that genuinely got to me in a way none of the others ever did, and it continues to stick with me clearly to this very day. This happened about 4 years ago, right around the time I was finishing up my freshman year of college. I had been living in the dorms that year alongside a genuinely great roommate, and overall, my first year experience had been a really positive one. However, toward the end of that final semester, something felt distinctly different within our specific hall of the dormitory building. All of us who lived there were still generally our usual lively selves, but simply walking into that hallway began giving off this heavy, unmistakable feeling of dread. We all initially chalked it up to the mounting stress of final season approaching, but even accounting for that stress, something about the atmosphere just felt genuinely off. One night, after finishing up a long study session, I decided to take a quick shower before finally getting some sleep ahead of my classes early the next morning. Before continuing with the actual story, I think it helps to first explain the specific layout of our dormitory hall and its shared bathroom. Our particular hall was one of several identical halls located on the same floor, each hall containing 4 separate rooms, most designed to house 2 students each, aside from a single room reserved specifically for the resident advisor. The entrance into each hall consisted of a massive, heavy steel door featuring a small window positioned near one end. Directly across from that entrance sat the communal bathroom. Honestly, the entire setup felt considerably more like a prison block than any kind of normal college living space. As for the layout of the bathroom itself, walking inside immediately put you face to face with 2 separate sets of sinks, positioned on either side of the room, each set featuring 2 individual sinks. Large mirrors hung directly above each set, positioned exactly opposite one another, creating that classic, unsettling visual effect where your own reflection repeats infinitely backward into the distance. Beyond those sinks, further into the bathroom, were 2 urinals along with a single toilet stall positioned on the left side, and 2 separate shower stalls located on the right side. When standing at the left set of sinks, you could see directly into those shower stalls through the mirror, assuming the shower door happened to be open at the time. Similarly, standing at the right set of sinks allowed you to catch the reflection of that same shower area. The bathroom door itself matched the same heavy industrial design as the hall's main entrance, a solid steel frame featuring that same small, limited visibility window. That night, the door had been propped fully open using a large wooden wedge, one sturdy enough that the door genuinely could not swing shut again unless someone deliberately forced it closed themselves. So, returning to the actual events of that night, I found myself completely alone in that bathroom, getting ready to shower. I set my change of clean clothes down on the right side sink counter, positioning them there specifically so I could easily reach around the edge of the shower stall and grab them once I finished washing up. Right after setting my clothes down, I happened to glance upward into the mirror in front of me. And that is when I first noticed something strange, a faint, almost shimmering distortion visible somewhere deep within the reflected layers of the shower stall, positioned far back within that infinite mirror effect. As I continued watching, I noticed that this shimmering distortion appeared to be slowly moving closer, almost as though it were deliberately jumping forward from one reflected layer to the next, gradually working its way toward the foreground of that repeating mirror image. I felt a small twinge of unease at first, though I mostly assumed it was simply the lingering effects of coming down off a fairly intense combination of energy drinks, Adderall, and general caffeine overload from my earlier study session. But then, this strange shimmering shape began moving noticeably faster, continuing its steady approach through each successive mirrored layer. As it drew closer, I started to make out some vague details, though nothing especially clear or defined, just a dark, indistinct mass that appeared to be covered in something resembling long strands of hair. By this point, genuine panic had fully taken hold of me. This thing continued growing closer within that mirrored reflection, and I found myself completely frozen in place, unable to move or look away. As it finally reached the fourth reflected layer, the closest and clearest view I would ever end up getting of it, and I deeply regret every single second of that particular look. What I had originally mistaken for hair was actually some kind of long, flowing veil, translucent enough in places that you could partially see through certain sections of it. Though from roughly the torso downward, the figure was simply solid, impenetrable black. And then there was its face. I genuinely do not have adequate words to fully describe it. It was unmistakably human in its general shape and structure, and yet, at the exact same time, it felt entirely, unsettlingly removed from anything actually human. It had eyes, distinctly black in color, yet somehow impossibly glowing at the same time. I only caught that specific, detailed glimpse for maybe a single full second at most, but that brief image has remained permanently burned into my memory ever since. Immediately after that, the bathroom lights cut out entirely, and I heard the heavy door slam shut behind me, despite that thick wooden wedge that should have made closing it completely impossible under normal circumstances. The bathroom was plunged into complete, total darkness, and I could no longer see whatever this thing actually was anywhere around me. I moved toward the door, trying desperately to open it again, but it refused to budge no matter how hard I pushed or pulled against it. Then, an overwhelming, intense smell of blood hit me completely out of nowhere, flooding the darkened room entirely. That is the last thing I remember from that entire night. I woke up sometime later inside a hospital room. According to my resident advisor, he had been walking toward the bathroom himself sometime after all of this happened, and he found me lying inside the shower stall, my shirt completely soaked through with blood from what turned out to be a massive, uncontrolled nosebleed. He told me he tried asking me directly what had happened, and according to him, the only response I managed to give him was simply, "It saw me," immediately followed by a complete, overwhelming panic attack. He called an ambulance right away, and I was rushed to the hospital. Apparently, I continued panicking so intensely throughout the entire process that the medical staff eventually had to sedate me, just to get me calm enough to be properly treated. I regained full consciousness again around the same time my parents arrived at the hospital, both of them understandably worried sick about me. I asked them what exactly had happened. According to the doctors treating me, their initial assessment suggested I had experienced some kind of seizure. However, once I was stable and cooperative enough to undergo further testing, they performed a CAT scan and found absolutely no evidence that any actual seizure had taken place. On top of that, there is no family history of epilepsy anywhere in my family whatsoever. And despite having taken Adderall countless times, both before and after this specific incident, I have never once experienced anything remotely similar, whether hallucinations or any kind of seizure-like symptoms, at any other point, either before or since that particular night. To this day, I genuinely struggle to look directly into any mirror for more than a single minute at a time. Simply being trapped in a room containing a mirror for any extended period is enough to trigger a full emotional breakdown for me. I have been attending regular therapy for going on 3 years now, specifically because of this experience. And I have also spoken with numerous different religious leaders over that same period, hoping desperately for some kind of clearer explanation or guidance. Beyond the fairly generic advice to simply turn toward faith during difficult times like these, none of them have been willing to specifically identify what I experienced as anything demonic or inherently evil in nature. What makes the entire situation even stranger is the fact that before this specific incident occurred, there had never been any previous reports or claims of unusual paranormal activity within that particular dormitory. And in the years since I personally moved out, there have been no further reports of anything similar happening there either. Whatever happened to me that night appears to have been an entirely isolated, singular incident, unconnected to any broader pattern of activity either before or after. Looking back on everything now, from the growing sense of unease that had settled over our entire hallway in the weeks leading up to that night, to the specific, detailed image of that veiled figure slowly approaching through the mirrored reflections, to finally waking up in a hospital bed with no memory of what had actually happened in between, this entire experience remains, without question, the single most terrifying and unexplainable thing that has ever happened to me throughout my entire life. I have turned every single detail over in my mind countless times since it happened, searching desperately for some kind of rational explanation that might finally allow me to move past it entirely. The stimulant combination I had consumed earlier that night remains the most obvious potential explanation available. And yet, the specific, vivid clarity of what I saw, combined with a complete absence of any prior history of hallucinations from that same combination of substances, along with a confirmed absence of any actual seizure activity, continues to leave that explanation feeling incomplete and ultimately unsatisfying. I do not know if I will ever fully move past what happened to me in that bathroom that night. The image of that veiled, dark figure, its impossible glowing black eyes fixed directly on me through that endless repeating mirror reflection, remains permanently etched into my memory, resurfacing vividly every single time I find myself standing anywhere near a mirror for more than just a brief moment. Whatever it actually was that I encountered that night, it left behind a lasting mark on me that 3 years of ongoing therapy still have not managed to fully heal. This happened back when I was still a kid, somewhere around 10 or 11 years old, and it remains one of the strangest, most unsettling experiences from my entire childhood. At the time, my great-grandfather was nearing the end of his life, his health declining significantly following the death of his wife just a month or so earlier. Given his age and the recent loss he had just experienced, all of us in the family were fully aware that his time remaining was likely limited. During that same period, he kept telling everyone in the family that he had been seeing strange, unexplainable things around his home. Unfortunately, given his age and the general assumption that his mind might simply be starting to slip a little, no one in the family took his claims particularly seriously. Most of us, myself included at the time, simply chalked up what he was saying to the natural effects of getting older, assuming it was nothing more than confusion or mild hallucination brought on by his advanced age. Being the kind of person he was, though, he decided to take matters into his own hands. He pulled out his old Polaroid camera and began taking pictures of various things around his house, seemingly determined to prove that what he had been experiencing was genuinely real, rather than simply a product of his own aging mind. Most of the photographs he ended up taking did not turn out to show anything particularly unusual or noteworthy. But one specific photograph did, and that particular image has remained permanently burned into my memory ever since. The photograph in question showed his television set, which, importantly, was completely turned off at the exact moment the picture was taken. Despite the television being off, the image captured on that Polaroid clearly showed something resembling a dark shadow positioned directly on the screen. Though it was immediately obvious, once you looked closely, that whatever this shape actually was, it was clearly not simply an ordinary shadow. The shape bore a strong resemblance to an actual person, complete with two distinct arms, each one ending in four clearly defined pointed fingers rather than the typical five you would expect from an actual human hand. And, as strange as this next detail sounds, I promise you I am telling this exactly as it appeared. The figure also had what could only be described as some kind of halo positioned directly above its head. What made this particular halo especially strange, though, was that it did not match the way halos are typically depicted in movies or other media. That classic, simple circular ring you usually picture floating above a figure's head. Instead, this specific shape looked much more like an inverted horseshoe, extending directly from one shoulder to the other, with a space inside that horseshoe shape filled with a series of perfectly formed triangles. The figure's head itself was turned completely sideways, facing off to the right, allowing us to clearly make out its full outline and profile from that particular angle. My entire family ended up seeing this photograph together once it was developed and shared around. I distinctly remember my aunt's exact reaction in that moment, blurting out that it looked like a monster, a comment that has stuck with me clearly ever since, given just how genuinely unsettled her voice sounded as she said it. Sometime later, after that initial shock had settled somewhat, we went looking for my grandmother, hoping she might still have that specific photograph stored away somewhere safe, assuming she would have had the good sense not to simply throw away something so strange and significant. When we asked her directly about it, though, she completely denied any knowledge of the photograph whatsoever, repeatedly insisting that she had no idea what we were even talking about, despite having clearly seen and reacted to that exact same image alongside the rest of us only a short time earlier. Even now, so many years later, I can still picture that image with startling clarity whenever I think back on that entire experience. If anyone were genuinely curious to see exactly what it looked like, I honestly believe I could still draw a fairly accurate recreation of that shape from memory alone, given just how vividly that specific image has remained lodged in my mind ever since that day. Thinking back on the entire situation now, several specific details continue to stand out to me as particularly unsettling and difficult to fully explain away using any conventional, rational reasoning. My great-grandfather's insistence, in the weeks leading up to his own death, that he had been seeing strange, unexplainable things throughout his house, only to then be almost universally dismissed by the rest of the family as simply confusion brought on by old age, adds an especially poignant, unsettling layer to the entire story, particularly once that Polaroid photograph seemingly confirmed that he genuinely had been perceiving something real and tangible all along. The specific visual details captured within that photograph remain the most difficult aspect of the entire story to rationalize. A television that was completely powered off should not have been capable of displaying any kind of reflection or image on its screen, let alone one depicting such a specific, detailed humanoid figure. The four-fingered hands, rather than the expected five, along with that unusual geometrically patterned halo shape stretching from shoulder to shoulder, filled with those precise triangular sections, do not correspond with any conventional depiction of angels, spirits, or similar figures typically found within mainstream religious or cultural imagery. If anything, the deliberate strangeness and specificity of those particular details makes the entire image feel even more unsettling. precisely because it does not match any familiar, expected visual template that could be easily explained away as some kind of subconscious cultural influence or expectation bleeding into the photograph. My aunt's immediate visceral reaction upon first seeing the photograph, blurting out that it looked like a monster, continues to stand out in my memory as well, specifically because of how genuine and unfiltered that response felt in the moment. It was not a considered, thoughtful reaction, but rather an immediate, instinctive exclamation. The kind of response that tends to emerge honestly and directly from real, unfiltered fear rather than any kind of performative or exaggerated reaction for the benefit of others watching. Perhaps the most genuinely unsettling detail from this entire story, though, remains my grandmother's later denial regarding the photograph's existence altogether. Every other member of the family present that day clearly remembered seeing that same image together, reacting collectively to its strange, unsettling details in real time. Yet when specifically asked about it afterward, my grandmother firmly and repeatedly denied any knowledge of the photograph whatsoever, despite having been standing right there with the rest of us at the exact moment we all first saw and reacted to it together. I have wondered many times over the years what might have actually motivated that specific denial on her part. Was she simply so deeply unsettled by what she had witnessed that she found it easier to convince herself, and by extension attempt to convince the rest of us, that the entire incident had never actually happened at all? Or was there some other explanation entirely behind her reaction? Something I have never been able to fully understand or uncover in all the years since that day. Given that this entire experience took place during such an emotionally significant period for our family, so soon after the loss of my great-grandmother and while my great-grandfather himself was clearly nearing the end of his own life, I have often found myself wondering whether there might be some deeper, more meaningful connection tied to the timing of everything. Was whatever appeared on that television screen somehow connected specifically to my great-grandmother's recent passing, some kind of lingering presence tied directly to her, or perhaps some entirely separate presence that had simply chosen that particular moment during such a vulnerable and emotionally charged period for our family to make itself visible. I do not have any clear or definitive answers to any of these lingering questions, even now, so many years removed from actually experiencing this story firsthand as a young child. What I do know with complete certainty is that my great-grandfather had been telling the truth the entire time, despite how quickly and easily the rest of us had originally dismissed his claims as nothing more than the natural confusion of old age. Whatever he had genuinely been seeing throughout those final weeks of his life, that single surviving photograph offered undeniable, tangible proof that something real and deeply strange had indeed been present in that house alongside him, visible enough, even if only briefly, to be captured clearly on film and witnessed collectively by every single member of our family gathered there that day. About 10 years ago, back when I was around 19 years old, I had a very close friend who shared my own strong interest in anything related to the paranormal. At some point during that friendship, she ended up purchasing a specific type of spirit board, similar in concept to a traditional Ouija board, though this particular version was called the Psychic Circle. It featured a combination of words, images, and various symbols, along with an accompanying instruction book meant to help guide whoever was using it in properly interpreting whatever messages might come through. For a while, the two of us used this board together fairly regularly, though, honestly, we never had much genuine luck getting it to work in any convincing or meaningful way. Then, one particular night, my friend decided to bring the board along with her to visit her aunt's house. According to what she told me afterward, the two of them ended up having an incredibly intense experience while using the board together that night. Something significantly beyond anything either of us had ever managed to produce on our own. Following that specific session, her aunt asked if she could hold on to the board for a few additional nights, wanting the opportunity to use it further by herself. My friend agreed, leaving the board behind with her aunt, and the two of us made plans to visit together that upcoming weekend so all three of us could try using the board together as a group. That Friday night finally arrived, and we headed over to her aunt's house together, both of us genuinely hoping for some kind of exciting, meaningful, supernatural experience. The moment I got into the car to head over there, though, I was hit with an overwhelming, immediate feeling of dread, one that settled deep into my stomach almost instantly. I want to make clear that I had already had a handful of previous brushes with paranormal experiences throughout my life up to that point, and generally speaking, that kind of prospect never particularly frightened me on its own. But this specific feeling felt distinctly different, an unmistakable sense that something about this particular situation simply felt wrong from the very start. Once we finally arrived at her aunt's house, I noticed almost immediately that her aunt seemed to dislike me, seemingly for no clear reason, the very instant I walked through her front door. That same overwhelming sense of dread I had felt earlier in the car only intensified further the moment I stepped inside that house. I tried my best to simply brush the feeling off as some kind of irrational paranoia on my part, doing my best to remain friendly and polite despite the clearly cold reception I was receiving. My friend's aunt eventually retrieved the board from wherever she had been keeping it, pulling it out of its original box. The moment I actually saw the board itself, I was genuinely taken aback by its appearance. It looked incredibly old and weathered, far more aged and worn than it had looked just a few days earlier when my friend had originally brought it over. It appeared almost as though it had somehow been left sitting out directly under intense sunlight for several years straight. Its once bright, vivid colors now faded and dulled considerably. My friend immediately asked her aunt what on earth had happened to the board, clearly just as shocked by its dramatically changed appearance as I was. Her aunt responded simply, telling us that the board had been sweating. Her aunt placed the board down on the table between us, looking directly at me the entire time with an expression of deep, unmistakable suspicion. By this point, I found myself genuinely terrified, my hands turning clammy and visibly shaking as the tension in the room continued building. I reached forward and placed my fingers gently on the board's oracle piece, the small pointer used to help guide and interpret whatever messages might come through. The instant I did, her aunt sharply said no, stopping me immediately. I quickly pulled my hands back away from the board. Her aunt then explained further, telling us plainly that whatever presence they were dealing with clearly did not like me, and had no interest whatsoever in answering any questions I might have. She said she could simply tell, speaking with complete, unwavering certainty. Given everything that had just happened, both my friend and I decided it was best to leave shortly afterward. My friend was noticeably upset by the entire situation, telling me directly that her aunt's behavior throughout that entire evening had been completely out of character for her. Nothing at all like the woman she normally knew. Her aunt ultimately refused to return the board to my friend after that night, choosing instead to keep it for herself. Eventually, I ended up purchasing my own separate spirit board, hoping perhaps for a slightly better experience on my own terms. Unfortunately, I never had any particular luck with that board either. And eventually, I decided to interpret that lack of success as some kind of meaningful sign, ultimately passing that board along to a different group of friends instead. Looking back on that entire experience now, several specific details continue to stand out to me as particularly unsettling and difficult to fully explain away using any conventional rational reasoning. That initial overwhelming feeling of dread I experienced the moment I got into the car remains one of the most significant details from the entire story, specifically because it arrived so suddenly and so intensely, completely unprompted by anything specific happening around me at that particular moment. Given my own prior history and general comfort level with paranormal experiences up until that point, the sheer intensity and specificity of that particular feeling of wrongness stood out clearly as something different from my usual reactions to similar situations. The dramatic physical transformation of the board itself remains another deeply unsettling detail from this entire story. Boards like that, made from cardboard and printed materials, simply do not naturally age and weather so dramatically within the span of just a few short days, especially when kept safely indoors rather than exposed directly to prolonged sunlight or harsh weather conditions. Her aunt's specific explanation, describing the board as having been sweating, only adds an additional unsettling layer of strangeness to the whole situation, since that particular phrase implies some kind of active, ongoing process happening to the board itself, almost as though it had been reacting physically to whatever intense experience had taken place during that earlier session between my friend and her aunt. Her aunt's immediate, unexplained hostility toward me specifically also remains difficult to fully rationalize. According to my friend, this behavior was completely inconsistent with her aunt's usual personality and demeanor, suggesting that whatever was driving that specific reaction toward me that particular evening was not simply a matter of ordinary personal dislike or pre-existing tension between us. The fact that her aunt specifically framed her objection in terms of whatever presence they had apparently been communicating with, insisting that this presence specifically did not want to answer any of my questions, adds a particularly unsettling dimension to the entire situation, implying some kind of direct personal awareness or judgment being made about me specifically by whatever they had been in contact with during that earlier session. I have thought many times since that night about what exactly might have happened during that earlier session between my friend and her aunt. The one that apparently proved so intense that it prompted her aunt to specifically request additional time alone with the board afterward. Neither my friend nor her aunt ever fully explained to me exactly what had occurred during that particular session, beyond simply describing it as intense, leaving me with plenty of room to wonder and speculate about what specifically might have happened to leave such a lasting impression on both of them. My own subsequent attempts using a separately purchased board, despite yielding no particular results of my own, have left me with a lingering sense of unresolved curiosity regarding that entire situation. Whether my lack of success with my own board was simply coincidental, or whether it carried some deeper significance connected to whatever had happened during that original session at her aunt's house, remains something I have never been able to fully determine one way or another. Even now, a full decade removed from that particular Friday night, I still find myself thinking back on that overwhelming sense of dread I felt the moment I climbed into that car, an instinctive, almost primal warning sign that, in hindsight, turned out to be entirely justified by everything that unfolded once we actually arrived at her aunt's house. Whatever exactly was present in that house that evening, communicating through that strange, weathered board, it left behind a lasting impression on all three of us, one that neither my friend, her aunt, nor I have ever fully managed to explain or fully move past in all the years since. I really do not know why I am reading stories like this at night when I already have a tendency to get paranoid. Maybe part of me enjoys being scared. Maybe another part of me keeps hoping I will finally come across something that explains some of the things I experienced growing up. I have lived in two houses where strange things happened, and although I cannot prove any of it was paranormal, there were enough incidents over the years that both places still make me uncomfortable when I think about them. The first house was in northern Illinois. It was old, not just a little dated. It felt ancient to me as a kid. I lived there from around kindergarten age until the end of 7th grade, so a huge part of my childhood happened inside that house. When you are that young, your home becomes your entire world. You know the sounds it makes. You know which floorboards creak. You know what the pipes sound like. You know how the hallway looks when the lights are off. You know the shadows from the windows. At least, you think you do. That house always seemed to have something strange going on. Some experiences were small, things seen from the corner of my eye, movement where there should not have been movement, sounds from another room when nobody was there, nothing that would prove anything. Old houses are noisy. Children have active imaginations. Peripheral vision is unreliable. I understand all of that. But some experiences were harder for me to dismiss. One of the earliest things I remember happened when I was very young. At night, when I was lying in bed and starting to fall asleep, I would sometimes hear a woman singing. It was soft, very soft, not loud enough to make out clear lyrics. It was more like a gentle voice somewhere nearby, quietly singing as I drifted towards sleep. The strange part was that I was not afraid of it. Actually, it comforted me. The voice would lull me to sleep. I became so used to hearing it that for a long time I did not even think of it as strange. Children accept things differently from adults. If something happens regularly enough when you are 5 or 6 years old, it simply becomes part of how the world works. For me, falling asleep sometimes meant hearing that soft singing. I do not remember asking who it was. Maybe I assumed it was my mother. That would have been the obvious explanation. But I also remember hearing it when my mother was already asleep. There were even times when she was not home. And still, the singing would come. Quiet, calm, close enough to hear. It never shouted. It never said my name. It never seemed threatening. It was simply a woman's voice singing softly while I lay in bed. For years, that was one of the least frightening strange things that happened in the house. Then one day, the singing stopped. I do not remember exactly when. There was no final night where I heard the voice say goodbye. I just realized at some point that it had not happened in a long time. It was gone. Strangely enough, I almost missed it. Whatever the cause had been, it had become part of my bedtime routine. When it disappeared, the house felt quieter. Looking back as an adult, I know there are possible explanations. Children can experience sounds while drifting into sleep. There are hypnagogic hallucinations, where the brain can produce voices, music, or other sensations during the transition between wakefulness and sleep. Maybe that explains the singing. It is probably one of the more reasonable explanations. But as a child, I did not know any of that. I only knew that someone seemed to sing me to sleep. The house had other strange moments, too. I would see shapes moving at the edge of my vision. I would turn and find nothing. Sometimes I heard noises from parts of the house that should have been empty. Again, none of those things by themselves are especially convincing. An old house settling can sound almost human. Wood contracts. Pipes knock. Wind moves things. And peripheral vision is designed to notice movement, not to give you perfect detail. Your brain can turn a coat, curtain, or shadow into a person for half a second. I know that now. But there was one visual experience from that house I still remember clearly. I saw a man looking into my bedroom window. That would be creepy enough in any house. The problem was that my bedroom was on the 2nd floor. I remember seeing him standing there looking through the glass. A man. At a window that should not have had a person outside it. I do not remember every detail of his face anymore. It has been too long. I do not want to pretend I can describe something perfectly when childhood memory is involved. But I remember the shock, the immediate realization that someone was where nobody should have been. There was no porch outside that window, no balcony where someone could casually stand. As far as I knew, there was no reasonable place for a man to be positioned and looking directly inside. I remember staring. Then, like so many strange childhood memories, the exact ending becomes less clear. Maybe I looked away. Maybe I called for someone. Maybe the figure disappeared immediately. What stayed was the image. A person outside a second-story window. That first house always felt strange to me, but it was also my childhood home. The weirdness became mixed together with normal memories. Birthdays, school mornings, family arguments, holidays, playing, sleeping. The singing voice and strange shadows were only part of a much larger childhood. Eventually, we moved. The second house was in the next town over, and that was where the experiences became more frightening to me. The things in the first house had often been quiet. A voice, a figure, movement from the corner of my eye. In the second house, some incidents felt much more physical, more aggressive. These memories are not in chronological order. I do not remember exactly which strange event happened first. They are just separate moments that stayed with me. One night, I was sitting alone in the living room at around midnight. I was watching television. There was some dumb repo show on because, as anyone who has stayed up watching television that late knows, there is usually nothing good on. The dog was sitting with me on the couch. That detail matters because the dog reacted too. I was relaxed, not thinking about ghosts, not reading scary stories, just watching television. The house was quiet. The living room connected to the kitchen through 2 hallways. The layout basically formed a circle. You could leave the living room through one hallway, reach the kitchen area, then come back through the other hallway. One of those halls had a door leading into the garage. I was sitting there when suddenly I heard a loud bang against that garage door. Both the dog and I turned toward the sound. That got my attention immediately. There is something reassuring about an animal reacting at the same time as you. If I had been alone and heard it, I might have wondered whether I imagined it. But the dog heard something too. Its head snapped toward the hallway. For a few seconds, I listened. Nothing else happened. I tried to shrug it off. Maybe something in the garage shifted. Maybe an object fell against the door. Maybe the house made a loud settling noise. I did not want to scare myself. So I kept watching television. About 30 minutes passed. By then, I had mostly stopped thinking about the first noise. Then another bang hit the garage door. This one was much louder. And this time, the door flew open. Not a few inches. It swung open around 90 degrees. I froze. Now I was terrified. A door opening after a loud impact is very different from hearing a random noise. My first thought was not ghost. It was intruder. Someone is in the garage. Someone just forced the door open. That possibility scared me much more than anything paranormal. The dog was alert. I got off the couch. I needed something to defend myself with. I grabbed the nearest object I thought I could use as a weapon. To this day, I cannot remember whether I grabbed a fireplace poker first or if I somehow ended up choosing a shoe. Knowing myself, I may genuinely have chosen the shoe, which would have been an absolutely useless decision if someone was actually breaking into the house. But fear does not turn everyone into an action hero. Sometimes your brain panics and you pick up the dumbest object within reach. I did not want to walk directly toward the open door. If someone was hiding on the other side, I would be walking straight into them. So I used the layout of the house. I went through the opposite hallway. That way, I could circle around toward the garage door from another direction and avoid being surprised from the front. My heart was pounding. I moved slowly. I listened for footsteps. Breathing, anything, nothing, I reached the other side. The garage door was still open. I looked into the garage. Nobody was there. At least, nobody I could see. I checked the main garage door. Locked. I checked the exterior door that led toward the backyard. Locked, too. There was no obvious way anyone could have entered. I stood there, trying to make sense of it. Maybe pressure inside the house had pushed the door open. Maybe the latch had not caught correctly. Maybe something struck it from the garage side. But what? I found no person, no animal, nothing lying on the ground that obviously explained the bang. And the exterior doors were secured. Eventually, I closed the door again. I went back to the living room. I do not remember enjoying the rest of that television show. For the rest of the night, every small sound made me look toward the hallway. The dog staying near me helped. At least I knew I was not the only living thing awake. That incident stayed with me because it felt physical. Something had happened to the door. It had actually moved. Whatever the explanation, I did not invent the door being open. I saw it. The dog heard the bang. There was something real to explain. I just never found out what it was. Another experience happened in the bedroom I shared with my brother. At the time, we did not have a proper bedroom door. For a while, we had tried using a curtain instead, but even that did not work well because we could not keep the rod from falling. So basically, our bedroom doorway was open. My brother and I were in the room together. I was lying on my bed. He was at the computer. We were talking. Normal evening. Nothing frightening. At some point, my brother said something odd. I do not remember what it was. Whatever he said made me sit up so I could look at him. As I moved, something near the doorway caught my attention. I looked over. There was a white figure peering around the doorframe. I only saw the upper part. Shoulders, neck, head. It looked like a person leaning around the doorway to look into our room. I stared. The figure was pale, or white enough to stand out. The strangest part was the physical space where it appeared. The area just outside that side of the doorframe had only a tiny gap before the wall continued into my sister's room. There were maybe 3 inches of space. A human being could not stand there and lean around normally. There simply was not enough room for a body. But the figure looked like someone was doing exactly that. Peering in, watching us. I remember the shape more than the face. I do not remember clear features. Maybe there were none. Maybe I did not look long enough. But I knew I was seeing something roughly human from the shoulders up. For a moment, my mind tried to place it. Was it my sister? Someone in the hallway? A piece of clothing? A reflection? But the geometry of the space made no sense. There should not have been enough room for a person where the figure appeared. I do not remember it staying for long. Like many strange visual experiences, it seemed to be there and then not there. My brother was still at the computer. The room was otherwise normal. I was left sitting in bed wondering what I had seen. That image has stayed with me for years. The white shoulders, the neck, the head, leaning around the frame. If I had only seen it from the corner of my eye, I could dismiss it more easily. But something caught my attention, and I actually looked. Again, I know perception can be wrong. Lighting can create shapes. Peripheral vision can trigger a false interpretation before your brain catches up. And memories become less reliable over time. I do not present the figure as proof of anything. I only know what I believed I saw. The second house had other moments too. Sounds, movement, that sense that someone was nearby when nobody should be. Over time, I started expecting weird things. And once you expect them, it becomes difficult to know where the house ends and your anxiety begins. That is something I think about a lot now. If you live somewhere you believe is haunted, you start paying attention differently. Every bang matters. Every shadow matters. You hear a noise in the kitchen, and instead of thinking refrigerator, you think someone is there. You see movement outside a window, and your brain creates a person before you have even focused. That does not mean every experience is imaginary. It just means fear can amplify everything. I have always been somewhat prone to paranoia anyway. That is why reading scary stories late at night is probably a terrible idea for me. Even while writing this, I catch myself looking toward windows. I hear something move outside and immediately start imagining a person. I see something from the corner of my eye and turn quickly. Most of the time, there's nothing. Maybe a shadow, a branch, an animal, a reflection. The human brain is extremely good at finding threats, especially when you are already nervous. And tonight, while thinking about all of these old experiences, I keep getting that same feeling. I keep seeing little movements from the corner of my eye. I keep hearing what sounds like something moving outside my window. For a second, I could have sworn I saw someone out there. But I am not sure. And because I am already thinking about ghosts, old houses, unexplained figures, and doors opening by themselves, I do not trust that feeling completely. That is probably the smart response. When you are scared, check the obvious things first. Reflections, trees, neighbors, animals, wind, the house itself. If something genuinely seems wrong, get another person or move somewhere you feel safer. There is no reason to turn uncertainty into a monster before you have evidence. I wish I had understood that better when I was younger. As a child, the strange things in the first house felt automatically supernatural because I did not have many other explanations. The singing voice was a ghost. The shadows were ghosts. The man at the second-story window was something impossible. As I got older, I learned that sleep, memory, architecture, and perception can create experiences that feel extremely real. But even knowing that, some memories still bother me. The singing is one, partly because it was so consistent. I heard it repeatedly. It comforted me. Then one day it stopped. If it was only my brain creating a sound while I fell asleep, why that particular voice? Why singing? Maybe because that was what comfort meant to a child. Maybe somewhere in my memory I had heard my mother sing. Maybe my brain recreated it. That is plausible. The second-story man is harder emotionally, because the idea of a person looking into a child's window is horrifying, whether it was paranormal or not. If there really was a person outside, how did they get there? Was there some structure or tree near the window that I no longer remember correctly? Could someone have climbed? Maybe. Childhood memories can simplify architecture. What I remember as an impossible second-story window may have been more accessible than I realized. That explanation would be disturbing in another way. A real person outside a child's bedroom window is not better than a ghost. The second house changed the tone of everything. The garage door incident still stands out because the dog reacted. Something physically happened. There was a bang, then another bang, then the door opened. I searched. Nothing. Main garage entrance locked. Backyard door locked. Maybe the latch was faulty. That is probably the explanation I would test first now. A badly latched interior door can swing open from pressure changes. If something in the garage shifted or the HVAC system changed pressure, maybe that produced the bangs. Still, that second impact felt forceful. I remember the fear, the ridiculous weapon in my hand, trying to approach from the other hallway because I was convinced someone might attack me. That fear was real, even if the cause was ordinary. Then there was the white figure. That one has no moving door or physical evidence, only vision, which means I trust it less. But it scared me more. A door can be explained mechanically. A person-shaped thing peering into your bedroom feels personal. It was looking. At least, that is how I interpreted the posture. It was not simply standing in the hall. The shoulders and head were positioned like something trying to look around the doorway without fully entering the room. And there should not have been enough room for a body behind it. That detail bothered me. It still does. Maybe a trick of perspective created the impression. Maybe something hanging near my sister's room lined up in exactly the wrong way. Maybe my brain made a human figure out of random shapes. Our brains do that constantly. Faces in curtains, people in coats, figures in darkness. There is even a name for the tendency to find meaningful forms in random patterns. Knowing that helps. It does not erase the memory. Sometimes I wonder if growing up in the first house trained me to interpret unusual things as paranormal. By the time we moved to the second place, I already had a mental category for unexplained experiences. A strange sound was not just a sound. It joined everything that happened before. The singing, the shadows, the man, then the garage door, then the figure. Each experience made the next one easier to believe. That can create a powerful cycle. But there is another side, too. Maybe certain places really do produce strange experiences more often. Not necessarily because of ghosts. Old electrical systems can create unusual sounds. Buildings settle differently. Temperature changes affect materials. Animals move through walls. Low-frequency vibrations can make people feel uneasy. Carbon monoxide and poor air quality can cause strange symptoms. There are many physical things worth considering. When I was a kid, nobody was investigating any of that. We were just living there. So most of these events remain unanswered. I never found out who the singing woman was. I never found the man outside the second-story window. I never discovered what hit the garage door. I never learned what the white figure was. They are just pieces of memory. That is probably why they still have power. Unanswered events stay open. Your mind keeps returning to them, trying to finish the story. Maybe that is why I read paranormal stories even though they make me paranoid. I am looking for similarities. Someone else hears singing while falling asleep. Someone else sees a figure at an upstairs window. Someone else's dog reacts to a door opening by itself. Maybe if enough people experience something similar, it feels less strange. But it can also make the fear worse. You start seeing patterns everywhere. Tonight is a good example. As I write about this, I keep noticing movement, a sound outside, something at the edge of my vision. For a moment, I think I see a person near the window. Then I look properly. I cannot confirm anything. That uncertainty is uncomfortable, but it is also important. I do not want to turn every unexplained movement into another paranormal story. Maybe I am simply on edge because I have spent too long remembering frightening things. That is probably the most reasonable explanation. Still, there is something eerie about sitting at night and writing about old experiences while every little sound outside suddenly feels louder. Part of me wants to stop. Part of me keeps listening. I think back to being a child in that old Illinois house, lying in bed, waiting for sleep. Then, the soft voice. Singing, at the time, that sound made me feel safe. Maybe that is the strangest part of all of this. Not every unexplained thing frightened me. Some of it was comforting. The fear came later, as I grew older, as the experiences became more physical, as I understood more about what could happen to people. The second-story figure was frightening. The garage door felt threatening. The white shape watching from the bedroom entrance felt invasive. By then, whatever innocence I had about the strange things in our homes was mostly gone. I no longer thought of the unknown as automatically friendly. Maybe nothing paranormal ever happened in either house. I am completely willing to admit that. Maybe all of it can be explained. Sleep phenomena, old houses, faulty doors, peripheral vision, childhood memory, anxiety. Those are powerful explanations. But I also cannot pretend I did not experience these things. Something sang to me at night, or at least I heard singing. Something looked like a man outside a second-story window. Something struck the garage door hard enough to make both me and the dog react. Then the door opened. And one night, I looked toward my bedroom entrance and saw what looked like a white head, neck, and shoulders peering around a space where a person should not have been able to stand. Those are the memories. What they mean is a different question. Maybe nothing supernatural. Maybe something I still do not understand. I probably will never know. And honestly, writing all of this at night was a terrible idea. Every time something moves outside my window, I am looking up. Every time I catch a shadow from the corner of my eye, my heart jumps. I could swear I saw someone outside a few minutes ago. But after everything I have just been thinking about, I am not going to claim that I did. Sometimes, fear makes a shadow look like a person. Sometimes, a noise is only a noise. And sometimes, years later, you are still left wondering whether that was all it ever was. I was around 10 or 11 years old when this happened, and for a long time afterward, it was one of those memories that I could not think about without feeling nervous. At the time, my mom worked at a dental clinic about an hour away from our house. Because of the distance, my dad would usually go pick her up after work. The whole trip could take close to 2 hours, depending on traffic and how long he had to wait for her to finish. That meant there were evenings when my older sister and I were home alone for a while. Normally, that was not a big deal. My sister was older than me, so my parents trusted us to stay in the house together. We knew the basic rules. Keep the doors locked. Do not open them for strangers. Do not do anything stupid. Call our parents if there was a problem. It felt normal. In fact, I usually liked having the house without my parents around for a little while. We could watch whatever we wanted, eat snacks, relax. There was nothing scary about it. Our house had a slightly unusual layout. There was a staircase going from downstairs to the upper floor. Near the stairs was another room that connected toward both the garage and the basement. That area always felt a little darker and quieter than the rest of the house, especially at night. The garage was one direction. The basement was another. During the day, none of that mattered. At night, when the lights were low and the house was quiet, the area around that room sometimes felt different. Still, I never believed there was anything dangerous there. It was just part of our home. The night this happened, it was around 8 o'clock. My parents were both gone. My dad was out picking up my mom from work, so my sister and I were the only people who were supposed to be inside the house. I was downstairs eating. I do not remember exactly what I was having. Probably something simple. I remember the house being quiet. My sister was upstairs in the living room area, sitting on the sofa. Nothing strange had happened that evening. No sounds, no open doors, no reason to think anyone else was there. When I finished eating, I got up and started heading upstairs. I walked toward the staircase. As I began climbing, I passed the area near that room that connected to the garage and basement. Then I heard a voice, very deep, right there. Well, hello. I froze. Even now, I can remember how the voice sounded. It was low, much deeper than my dad's voice. much deeper than anyone I expected to hear in the house. At 10 or 11 years old, my first thought was not that some stranger had broken in. My first thought was that it sounded demonic. That was honestly how frightening it was. The voice did not sound friendly to me, even though the words themselves were simple. Well, hello, normally that could sound cheerful. But coming from a dark part of the house where nobody was supposed to be, in a voice that deep, it was terrifying. My whole body reacted before I had time to think. I ran. Actually, saying I ran does not really describe it. I stumbled up those stairs as fast as I could. I nearly tripped over myself trying to get away. I was moving so quickly that I barely knew where my feet were going. I did not look back. I did not say hello. I did not ask who was there. I did not investigate. I just wanted to get upstairs where my sister was. The second I reached the top, I rushed toward the sofa. My sister was sitting there. I practically hid behind it. I was completely panicked. She looked at me like I had lost my mind. I must have looked terrified. I told her I had heard someone downstairs, a man's voice. A very deep man's voice. At first, I think she probably thought I had imagined it. That would have made sense. I was younger. Maybe I had heard the television. Maybe something outside. Maybe a neighbor. Maybe I had scared myself. But I knew what I heard. The voice had come from inside the house. It sounded close. And it had spoken directly. Well, hello, that was not a random noise. It was not wood settling. It was not a pipe. Someone had said those words. I did not want to go back downstairs. My sister did not want to either. We started thinking about what to do. My parents were still away. We had no idea when they would be back. If someone really was inside the house, we were two kids alone with them. That thought made everything worse. At that point, my mind started imagining all kinds of things. Maybe someone was hiding in the basement. Maybe they had come through the garage. Maybe they had been inside the house for a long time, and we had not known. Maybe the voice belonged to someone who had been watching me eat. That possibility terrified me. How long had he been there? Had he seen me? Did he know my sister and I were alone? Was he coming upstairs? Every second suddenly felt dangerous. We listened. I do not remember hearing the voice again. That did not make me feel better. Silence was almost worse because it meant whoever had spoken could be moving quietly. I remember thinking about the stairs. If someone started coming up, we would hear them. At least I hoped we would. I eventually called 911. At that age, calling the police felt like a huge thing. You were taught that 911 is for real emergencies, not for jokes, not for small problems. Part of me was afraid I would get in trouble if there turned out to be nobody there, but another part of me knew something was wrong. I had heard a man in the house. My parents were not home. That was enough. I told the dispatcher what happened. I explained that my sister and I were alone and that I heard a strange man's voice downstairs. The police were sent to the house. Waiting for them felt much longer than it probably was. My sister and I stayed upstairs. We did not go searching. We did not try to be heroes. Looking back, I am glad. There are stories where people hear something strange and immediately decide to investigate every room. That might work in a movie. In real life, if you are 10 or 11 and hear an unknown adult man inside your house, the last thing you should do is walk toward him. We stayed put. Eventually, the police arrived. Seeing them immediately made me feel safer. Now, adults were there. Adults with flashlights. Adults who knew how to handle someone breaking into a house. I told them again what I had heard. They began checking the property. They searched downstairs. They checked the room near the garage. They checked the basement. They looked around for signs that someone had entered. That was when they found something. There were several smashed beer bottles on the floor in the basement. That was the first real evidence that I had not imagined the whole thing. Those bottles had not been there before. Someone had been inside. The police kept looking. Then they found that one of the basement windows was open. That explained how the person had gotten into the house. Suddenly, the whole situation became much more real. There had been an intruder, a real person, not a ghost, not a demon, not my imagination. Someone had climbed into our basement through a window while 2 children were home alone. That thought was almost worse than the paranormal explanation I had first imagined. When I heard the deep voice, I thought something supernatural was hiding near the basement. But a real stranger in your home is much more dangerous than any ghost story. The police started putting the pieces together. Apparently, there was a homeless man in the area who had been breaking into houses. He was looking for alcohol. He would get inside, steal booze, drink, and then move on. The smashed beer bottles in our basement fit that pattern. So did the open window. Eventually, police connected what happened at our house to him. The voice I heard had almost certainly been his. He had gotten into our basement. He had found alcohol. He had been drinking. Then, for some reason, while I was walking up the stairs nearby, he spoke. Well, hello. I still wonder why. Maybe he had not realized anyone was home until he saw me. Maybe he was drunk enough that he did not care. Maybe he thought it was funny to scare a kid. Maybe he was surprised and the words just came out. I have no idea. But the fact that he spoke to me means he knew I was there. That is what bothers me most. If he had simply broken into an empty basement and stolen alcohol, that would have been frightening but distant. Instead, he saw or heard me. He was close enough to say something. And I heard him clearly. I sometimes think about what would have happened if I had reacted differently. What if I had walked toward the voice? What if I had called out, "Who's there?" What if I had gone into the basement to check? I was a kid. He was an adult stranger who had broken into our house. He had already been drinking. There is no way to know what he might have done. Maybe he would have run. Maybe he was harmless apart from the stealing. Maybe he would never have hurt anyone. But there was no reason to take that chance. Running upstairs was the right thing to do. At the time, though, I did not think of it as a smart decision. I thought I was being a coward. I heard that voice and immediately panicked. I hid behind the sofa. Looking back, that fear protected me. I did not confront him. I did not get close enough for him to grab me. I went toward my sister. Then I called for help. That was exactly what I should have done. The police eventually arrested the man. Once we knew who he was, some of the mystery disappeared. There was no demon in the house, no ghost, no unexplained voice. There was a real human explanation. But that did not make the memory less scary. In some ways, it made it worse. When I was 10 or 11, I was afraid of monsters. Years later, I understood that the man in the basement had been much more real than any monster I could imagine. He had entered through a window. He had been drinking. He had moved around inside our home without us knowing. And for at least some amount of time, my sister and I had been upstairs while he was below us. That is terrifying. I still think about how normal the evening had felt before the voice. I had been eating. My sister was sitting upstairs. My dad was picking up my mom. Everything was routine. Meanwhile, there was another person in the house. That is probably the lesson that stayed with me most. Danger does not always announce itself. Sometimes there is no broken front door, no alarm, no loud crash. Someone can enter through a small basement window and stay quiet. You can continue eating dinner with no idea. Then you walk past the wrong room and hear, Well, hello. The police explained that the intruder had apparently been targeting houses where he could steal alcohol. I do not know how many homes he entered. I do not know how long he had been doing it. But the fact that they knew about him meant ours was probably not the only one. Maybe he had entered houses when people were sleeping. Maybe he had entered while people were away. Maybe other families never knew. That thought bothered me too. If I had not heard him speak, would we have discovered the break-in? Probably eventually. The basement window was open. The bottles were broken. But maybe not until my parents returned. Maybe he would have stayed longer. Maybe he would have come upstairs. There are too many possibilities. After the incident, my parents made changes to the house. They installed locks on all the windows, especially the basement windows. There was no way they were going to risk someone getting in that way again. The whole family became much more careful. Before that night, I do not think I had ever paid attention to whether a basement window was locked. Why would I? I was a kid. Windows were just windows. After that, every one of them became a possible entrance. You start looking at your home differently after someone breaks in. A basement is not just storage anymore. A garage is not just where the car is. A window is not just something you look through. Everything becomes part of security. For a while, I hated being near the basement at night. Even though I knew the man had been arrested, I still remembered the voice. Sometimes fear stays connected to a location after the danger is gone. I could walk past the room near the garage and immediately remember that moment. The deep voice, the surprise, the feeling of my body trying to get upstairs as quickly as possible. I knew nobody was there anymore. Still, my imagination replayed it. Well, hello, I think the voice scared me so badly because of how deep it was. At that age, I described it as nearly demonic. That is still the best way I can explain how it sounded to a child. It was not what I expected a normal stranger's voice to sound like. Of course, alcohol may have affected the man's speech. Maybe he naturally had a very deep voice. Maybe the room made it echo. Basements can change sound. Concrete walls, stairs, and enclosed spaces can make a voice seem lower and louder. Whatever the reason, it sounded horrifying to me. That is why I nearly fell over running upstairs. I remember feeling embarrassed later when we found out it was just a person. Just a person. That is funny to say now. A strange man had broken into our house while my sister and I were alone. There was nothing small about that. But at 10 or 11, discovering that the voice was human somehow made the experience feel less supernatural. I could explain it. The man entered through the window. He found alcohol. He drank it. He spoke. The police caught him. Cause and effect. That is much easier for the brain to process than a disembodied voice. Still, every explanation created another disturbing detail. If he spoke because he saw me, how close was he? Was he standing just inside the basement? Was he near the room beside the stairs? Could he see me clearly? Had he been watching for several seconds before saying anything? I never found out. I do not really want to know. I also do not know exactly what happened after I ran upstairs. Did he leave immediately? Maybe he realized the police would be called. Maybe he climbed back out the same window. Maybe he stayed hidden for a while before leaving. The officers did not find him still inside the house, so he was gone by the time they searched. That means at some point between speaking to me and the police arriving, he escaped. The thought of him moving through the basement while my sister and I were hiding upstairs still gives me chills. We were listening for sounds. He was probably trying not to make any. He knew we were there. We knew someone might be there. But neither side could see the other. That waiting period was probably more dangerous than I understood at the time. I was focused on whether the scary voice would come upstairs. I did not understand the reality of a burglar deciding how to get out. Thankfully, he chose to leave. Nobody was hurt. That is the most important part. My sister was safe. I was safe. My parents came home. The man was eventually arrested. The windows were secured. There were no further incidents like that. It ended about as well as it possibly could have. But the story stayed with me. People sometimes ask whether I have ever experienced anything paranormal. This story almost sounds like one at first. A child home alone. A dark room near the basement. A deep voice coming from somewhere unseen. Well, hello. It has all the pieces of a ghost story. But then the ending turns it into something else. There really was someone there. That is what makes it scary to me. The voice was not in my head. The dog did not make it. The house was not settling. An adult stranger had broken into our home. I had heard him. The police found the open window and the broken bottles. There was evidence. No supernatural explanation was necessary. That gives the experience a different kind of weight. You cannot tell yourself you imagined it. You cannot say it was just childhood fear. A man was actually inside. When I think back to it now, I realize how lucky we were. My parents happened to be away. My sister and I were vulnerable. The intruder could have reacted badly when he realized children were home. Maybe he could have tried to stop me from calling for help. Maybe he could have become violent. Instead, I ran. He left. That was it. Sometimes the best ending to a scary story is simply that nothing worse happened. The police also did their job quickly. They did not dismiss us because I was a kid. They searched the house. They noticed the bottles. They found the window. Then they connected the break-in to someone already known for similar behavior. That helped my family understand what happened. Without that information, I might have grown up believing there really was something paranormal in our basement. Imagine hearing that voice as a child and never getting an explanation. I would probably still be telling people about the demon that spoke to me from below the stairs. Instead, I know the truth. A real man broke in. And honestly, the truth is disturbing enough. For a while afterward, every small noise in the house made me nervous. If I heard something near the garage, I looked immediately. If there was a sound from the basement, I wanted someone else to check. I hated walking past that room alone at night. Even though the windows had locks now, fear does not disappear just because someone installs hardware. You need time. Eventually, the house felt normal again. The basement became just a basement. The room near the garage became just a room. The incident turned into a story. But I never forgot the voice. Out of everything that happened, that is the detail I remember most clearly. Not the police. Not the bottles. Not even the open window. The voice. Very deep. Unexpected. Right when I thought I was alone. Well, hello. I sometimes wonder whether the man ever realized how terrifying that sounded. Maybe to him it was casual. Maybe he was drunk and thought he was being friendly. Maybe he saw a kid passing and simply said hello. From his perspective, it might have meant nothing. From mine, it sounded like something evil had spoken from the darkness. That difference is almost strange enough to be funny now. Almost. But when I remember being that young, standing on those stairs, knowing my parents were an hour away, it is not really funny. It was pure fear. I did not know there was a homeless burglar stealing alcohol. I did not know police already had information about him. I only knew there was a voice in the house. A voice that should not have been there. And it had spoken to me. If there is one part of the story I am proud of, it is that I did not go looking. I ran. People sometimes criticize themselves for panicking, but panic can save you. My instincts told me to get away. So I did. I went to my sister. I called 911. Adults handled the rest. That was exactly what should have happened. Years later, I still think about the possibility that if I had been a little more curious, this could have ended very differently. Kids are curious. I easily could have walked toward the basement and asked who was there. Maybe I would have thought it was my dad somehow. Maybe I would have gone down 1 or 2 steps. Instead, the voice was scary enough to make me run immediately. So in a strange way, the thing that terrified me may also have kept me safe. The man was eventually arrested. My parents secured every window. Life moved on. But I never forgot that night. I was around 10 or 11 years old. My parents were away. My older sister and I were home alone. I was walking upstairs after eating when a deep male voice came from the dark area near the garage and basement. Well, hello, I ran upstairs as fast as I could. Police later found smashed beer bottles and an open basement window. The intruder turned out to be a man who had been breaking into houses to steal alcohol. Nothing supernatural happened. There was no demon, no ghost, just a stranger inside our home. And honestly, knowing that makes the story scarier, not less. I have told this story a few times before, mostly on posts where people were sharing creepy experiences, but it is one of those memories that has never really left me. Even after all these years, I can still remember the sound. That is the part that stayed with me more than anything else. The scream. This happened late at night, probably around 1 in the morning. My brother and I were still awake, sitting at my computer and reading random stuff online. I think it was something about Pokemon or some other completely normal thing. We were not watching horror movies. We were not telling ghost stories. We were not trying to scare ourselves. It was just another late night. The house was quiet. Our parents were in their bedroom. My brother and I were focused on the computer. Then, completely without warning, our parents' bedroom door started shaking violently. Not a little rattle, not the kind of movement caused by someone opening another door in the house. It shook hard enough to get our attention immediately. Before either of us could really react, we heard a scream from outside. I do not know how to properly describe that sound. Even calling it a scream does not feel strong enough. It was the most terrifying human sound I had ever heard. It was high, desperate, and completely wrong. It sounded like someone in absolute agony. Not just scared, not just yelling for help. It sounded like a person experiencing something so horrible that all they could do was scream. The second I heard it, I felt this overwhelming sense of dread. It was immediate. My body reacted before my mind understood anything. I felt cold. My stomach dropped. My heart started beating hard. There was this horrible feeling that something was very wrong outside. It is difficult to describe because I have been scared many times in my life. But this felt different. It was deeper, almost instinctive. Like some part of my brain heard that sound and decided I needed to get away from whatever was making it. My brother reacted the same way. We both jumped up. The first thing we thought about was our parents. Their bedroom door had just shaken violently. And then we heard that scream. For a moment, I thought maybe something had happened inside their room. We ran toward them. We rushed into the bedroom. My mother was already in complete panic mode. She had heard it too. My dad was scared, but he was more focused on my mother. He was trying to figure out what had happened while also calming her down. Nobody knew what caused the door to shake. Nobody knew where the scream had come from. Then, we heard it again. Another horrible cry from outside. All of us went toward the window. We wanted to see what was happening. At that point, we were thinking there might be some kind of emergency. Maybe someone was being attacked. Maybe there had been an accident. Maybe a woman was hurt somewhere near the house. We looked outside, and that was when we saw her. There was a young-looking woman walking slowly down our street. She was wearing a white dress. The street was mostly quiet and dark. At 1 in the morning, there were not many cars. Most houses were dark. The woman stood out immediately. She moved slowly. She was crying. Not normal crying. She was sobbing deeply as she walked. Every once in a while, the crying would turn into another scream or screech, that same horrible sound we had heard from inside the house. We all stared at her. At first, the scene did not feel supernatural. It felt like an emergency. A woman wandering down a street after midnight while screaming and crying could be hurt. She could have been attacked. Maybe someone was chasing her. Maybe she had escaped from somewhere. Maybe she was having some kind of mental health crisis. There were many possibilities. Whatever was happening, she clearly seemed like someone who might need help. My dad decided to go outside. Looking back, I honestly admire him for doing that. I do not know whether I would have had the courage. There was something about her voice that made me want to stay as far away as possible. But my dad did not want to ignore a woman who might be injured. He left the house. We stayed near the window. We watched him walk toward her. The woman kept moving. Slowly, still crying, still making those horrible sounds. My dad got close enough to speak to her. He asked whether she was okay. No response. He asked if she needed help. Nothing. She did not stop walking. She did not turn toward him. She did not look at him. She did not even seem surprised that a man had suddenly walked out of a house in the middle of the night and started asking questions. She acted as if he was not there. That was when the situation started feeling truly wrong. If she had been drunk, I would expect some reaction. If she was injured, maybe she would have looked at him. If she was terrified, maybe she would have asked for help. Even someone in a severe emotional crisis would usually show some sign that another person had approached. But she did nothing. She just kept walking. My dad moved near her and continued trying to talk. She ignored him completely. From inside the house, I could see his face. I will never forget it. At first, he looked concerned, then confused, then scared. My dad was not the kind of person who usually looked terrified. Seeing that expression on him made everything worse. He did not understand what he was looking at either. The woman kept walking down the road, sobbing, then suddenly letting out another scream. She never acknowledged him. It was almost like he did not exist, or like she was trapped in some experience none of us could see. After a short time, my dad stopped following. I think he realized there was nothing else he could do safely. He came back inside. The moment he returned, we started talking about what had just happened. Nobody had an explanation. We were all shaken. My mother was still terrified. My brother and I were trying to understand the woman. My dad still believed there was a chance she was in danger. Maybe she was badly injured. Maybe she was mentally unwell. Maybe something had happened to her that made her unable to respond. So he called the police. He reported a young woman walking down the street in a white dress, crying and screaming. He explained roughly where she was headed. The police said they would check the area. That made us feel a little better. At least professionals would look for her. If she needed medical help, maybe they could get it for her. If she had been attacked, maybe they would find whoever was responsible. We stayed awake for a while. Nobody really wanted to go back to sleep. Every sound outside made me nervous. I kept thinking I would hear that scream again. Maybe she would come back. Maybe she would stop in front of our house. Maybe she had already walked farther away. I do not remember hearing her again. Eventually, the night passed. The next day, we found out the police had not found her. No woman, no report of an injured person, no sign of an assault, nothing, as far as we were told. There was no evidence that anyone matching her description had been walking through the area. That was when the story became much harder to explain. All four of us had seen her. My dad had gone outside. He had stood near her. He had spoken directly to her. This was not one person seeing something from a dark window. There were multiple witnesses. The police arrived not long afterward. Yet somehow, they found nothing. Maybe she turned onto another street. Maybe she went into a house. Maybe someone picked her up. Those are all possibilities. There is no guarantee the police searched every possible location. She could have simply disappeared into the neighborhood before they arrived. That is probably the most reasonable explanation. But it still did not explain her behavior. Why did she ignore my dad? Why was she walking so slowly? Why was she screaming like that? And what caused our parents' bedroom door to shake right before we heard her? That part has always bothered me. Maybe the door was unrelated. Maybe vibration from something outside caused it. Maybe the scream startled someone inside, and a memory later connected the two events more closely. Memories change over time. I know that. But the way I remember it, the violent shaking of the bedroom door came immediately before the scream. Almost like an announcement. That is the part that gives the whole experience a paranormal feeling. After I started telling the story to other people, several of them suggested the woman might have been a banshee. Others immediately said La Llorona. That suggestion caught my attention because of where we lived. We were within walking distance of Mexico. Stories about La Llorona were not unfamiliar in the region. The legend, as I had heard it, was about the spirit of a woman who wandered crying and searching for her children after they drowned. There are different versions of the story. Like most old legends, details change depending on who is telling it, but the image is usually similar. A woman, often associated with white clothing, crying, wandering at night, sometimes near water. Sometimes her cries are treated as a warning or bad omen. When people heard my story, they immediately made that connection. Woman in white. Late at night, uncontrollable sobbing, terrifying screams, ignoring someone trying to speak to her, then disappearing before police could find her. I understand why people thought of La Llorona. I do not know whether I believe that explanation. I am cautious with stories like this. It is easy to experience something strange and then attach a legend to it afterward. If you already know a story about a crying woman in white, any unusual encounter with a woman wearing white can start looking like proof. I do not want to claim that we definitely saw some legendary spirit. We saw a woman, or at least all of us believed we did. That is all I can say with certainty. But even without the supernatural explanation, the experience was terrifying. A real woman walking down the street at 1 a.m. and screaming like that would still be frightening. If she was human, then something had gone terribly wrong in her life that night. Maybe she was in shock. Maybe she was intoxicated. Maybe she was mentally ill. Maybe she had just experienced a tragedy. Those explanations are sad rather than supernatural. But then I remember the way she ignored my dad. That detail still bothers me. He was close. He spoke loudly enough for her to hear. She gave him nothing. No glance. No change in pace. No body movement suggesting she had noticed. She continued like she was completely alone. Maybe that is possible during extreme shock. People can become disconnected from their surroundings. A person can be so overwhelmed that they do not respond normally. I know that. Still, watching it happen at night was unsettling. Then there was the sound itself. I wish I could reproduce it accurately. I cannot. Every description sounds too ordinary. People hear screams in movies all the time. Actors scream. People yell on roller coasters. Children scream when frightened. This did not sound like any of those things. There was pain in it. Something raw. It made every hair on my body stand up. The dread came before I had even seen the woman. That is important to me. I did not see a woman in white and then decide I was scared because she looked ghostly. The sound scared me first. My body reacted to it before I knew who or what was outside. When we finally looked and saw her, the visual only gave the sound a source. She looked young from where we were. The white dress made her easy to see. She did not seem to be running from anything. Nobody followed. There was no car driving slowly behind her. She was simply walking. That contrast was strange. If you heard the scream without seeing her, you would imagine someone being attacked. You would expect a person running, fighting, trying to escape. But she walked slowly, almost calmly except for the crying. That made the scream seem disconnected from her body. She would move slowly down the road. Sob, then release this horrible shriek. Then keep walking. There was something deeply unnatural about watching those two things together. My dad's reaction is probably what convinced me most that the experience was not just childhood fear. He was an adult. He went outside because he believed a person needed help. He was not telling a ghost story. He was trying to do the responsible thing. Then he came back looking genuinely disturbed. That expression has stayed with me. He did not say, "She's just drunk." He did not laugh. He called the police. Whatever he experienced standing near that woman was strange enough that he believed someone needed to investigate. I have sometimes wondered how close he actually got. Did he stand directly beside her? A few feet away? Did he see her face clearly? I do not remember every detail anymore. I do remember him speaking to her and getting absolutely no response. Maybe if I asked him now, he would remember more. But part of me does not really want to turn the memory into an investigation. The uncertainty is part of what makes it stay with me. There is another detail I think about. Where did she come from? We heard the scream. Then we looked outside. She was already in the street. Had she been walking for a long time before we heard her? Had she passed other houses? Did anyone else look outside? Surely a scream that loud should have woken someone. Maybe neighbors saw her too and never reported it. Maybe nobody wanted to get involved. Or maybe we were the only ones. I do not know. Then there is where she went. The police found no sign of her. Again, that does not mean she vanished supernaturally. There are plenty of places a person can go. A backyard, an alley, a vehicle, a house. Maybe she knew exactly where she was headed. Maybe the police arrived too late. But because my dad had just watched her walking slowly, it felt like they should have found something. If she was injured enough to scream like that, where did she go? If she was not injured, why was she screaming? If she lived nearby, why did nobody come forward? There are no answers. That is why stories like this stay creepy. If the next day we had learned that police found her and took her to a hospital, the whole event would become tragic, but understandable. We would say that poor woman was having some kind of crisis. End of mystery. Instead, there was nothing. So the memory remained open. And when people hear an open mystery involving a crying woman in white near the Mexican border, they naturally fill it with folklore. La Llorona. I had heard of her before, but I do not remember whether I immediately thought of the legend that night. Probably not. At the time, I was too scared. The comparison came later. People told me the story fit. A woman walking at night. White dress. Crying terrible screams. The legend is powerful because it plays on something very basic. Hearing a woman cry normally makes people want to help. Crying suggests pain, vulnerability. You want to approach. Then the legend turns that instinct into danger. The crying woman is not someone you should follow. That is what makes the story unsettling. My dad did exactly what a good person would do. He approached. He asked if she needed help. And she did not even look at him. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if he had followed her farther. Probably nothing. Maybe she eventually would have answered. Maybe she would have reached a house. But I am glad he did not. Something about the whole scene already felt wrong. There was no reason to push it. Another thing that bothers me is how the night started. My brother and I were doing something completely ordinary. Reading about Pokemon, that makes the memory feel more real. There was no build-up, no haunted location, no seance, no dare. We were not out in the desert looking for ghosts. We were inside our own home. Then the bedroom door shook. Then someone screamed. Ordinary life stopped immediately. I think that is why truly frightening experiences are often more effective than stories designed to scare you. Fear arriving without warning is different. You do not have time to prepare. One moment you are reading something stupid online. The next moment your entire family is standing at a window watching a screaming woman walk through the night. I have replayed the sound in my memory many times. I cannot hear it perfectly anymore. Memory fades. But I remember the emotional reaction, that unrivaled sense of dread. It was so strong that I can still remember how my body felt. Sometimes people describe supernatural encounters by saying they sensed something evil. I would not go that far. I did not sense a demon or spirit. I sensed danger. Something about that scream told my nervous system that something terrible was nearby. That could be completely biological. Humans are wired to react to screams. A scream communicates emergency. Of course my body panicked. That explanation makes sense. But the intensity remains memorable. My mother was deeply affected too. Seeing her panic made me more frightened. Children watch their parents to judge danger. When your parents stay calm, you feel safer. When your mother is terrified and your father looks confused and nervous, you know this is not something they understand either. That removes the normal safety net. For once, the adults did not have an answer. We all saw the same thing. I also think about the shaking bedroom door. It seems almost too dramatic. A violently rattling door followed by an unearthly scream outside sounds like something written for a horror movie. But that is how I remember it. Maybe there was wind. Maybe a pressure change in the house moved the door. Maybe the scream happened at the same time by coincidence. Those are possible, and I want to leave room for that. Coincidences happen. The human brain also links events together. If two frightening things happen within seconds, we naturally assume they are connected even when they may not be. Still, experiencing them one after another made the night feel like something had arrived. That is probably why the banshee interpretation came up too. In folklore, banshee cries are often associated with death or warning. Again, I do not know enough to connect our experience to a specific legend with confidence. People hear a terrifying female scream and immediately reach for the closest cultural story. It could just as easily have been a real person. But there is something strangely comforting about giving an unexplained experience a name. If you say La Llorona, then suddenly there are rules. There is a story. There are other witnesses across generations. Your experience belongs to something known. Without the name, all you have is a woman who appeared at 1 a.m, screamed, ignored your father, and disappeared. Maybe that is actually scarier. I have never seen her again. No similar incident happened later. There was no pattern. We did not start hearing crying outside every night. Nothing haunted the house afterward. It was one night, one encounter. Then it was over. That is another reason I hesitate to call it supernatural. Haunting stories often involve repeated activity. This did not. It was like our paths crossed with something for a few minutes and then separated forever. Whether that something was a troubled woman or something stranger, I cannot say. I do know that I still think about it whenever someone mentions La Llorona. The image returns immediately. White dress, dark street, slow steps, sobbing, then that scream. My dad walking toward her, trying to help. Her complete refusal to acknowledge him. His face when he came back. Those are the details. Sometimes I wonder what she looked like from his point of view. We saw her from the house. He saw her much closer. Did she look normal? Was her face visible? Was she crying actual tears? Did she look injured? I wish I remembered asking him those questions. Maybe I did. Maybe the answers are gone from my memory. The strongest details survived. The rest faded. That is another reason I am cautious when telling it. This happened years ago. I am not going to pretend every word and movement is perfectly preserved. But multiple people were there. The central event is not something I invented later. We all heard her. We all saw her. My dad interacted with her. The police were called. Then they found nothing. That much is real to me. I have heard people say it had to be La Llorona because of our location. Living close to Mexico definitely makes the comparison tempting. The legend is part of the cultural atmosphere in places near the border. Stories travel. Families tell them. People grow up hearing warnings about a crying woman. But location alone is not proof. A woman can wear white anywhere. A woman can cry anywhere. I do not need the folklore connection to believe something bizarre happened. The mystery works without it. Honestly, I almost prefer leaving it that way. Maybe we saw a woman in terrible distress who disappeared into the neighborhood before the police could find her. If so, I hope she survived whatever she was going through. I hope someone eventually helped her. That would be the human explanation. The alternative is much harder to think about, that there was no woman to help, that what we saw was something else, something walking down our street wearing the shape of a grieving young woman, something that did not care that my father was speaking to it, something whose scream shook us before we ever saw it. I do not know, and I am not going to pretend I do. What I know is that I was sitting at a computer with my brother around 1 a.m. when our parents' bedroom door shook violently. Then we heard the worst scream I had ever heard in my life. We ran to our parents. We looked outside. A young woman in white was walking slowly down the street, sobbing and occasionally screaming. My dad went outside because he thought she was in danger. He spoke to her. She ignored him completely. She never even acknowledged that he was there. He came back inside, visibly disturbed, and called the police. The police searched. They found no sign of her. Years later, people still tell me we saw a banshee or La Llorona. Maybe. Maybe not. All I can say is that whatever was walking down our street that night scared every person in our house. And even now, when I remember that scream, I feel a little of that same dread all over again. This is not the scariest story I have, but it is probably one of the strangest periods I remember from growing up. It happened in Central California during the lead-up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. At the time, I was around 14 years old. My hometown happened to sit roughly in the middle of three large military air bases, so military aircraft were already a normal part of life. We were used to seeing things flying overhead that people in other parts of the country might have found unusual. But during the month or so before the invasion, military activity seemed to increase a lot. We started seeing Apache helicopters almost every day. There were more aircraft moving through the area. There was a general feeling that something big was happening. Of course, everybody already knew war was becoming more likely. The news was full of it. Adults were talking about Iraq. Military preparations were being discussed constantly. So whenever something unusual happened in the sky, it was easy to assume the military had something to do with it. I want to be clear that I have never been able to confirm that the first two events I saw were actually connected to any military activity. The timing made that explanation seem reasonable to me, but I do not know for certain. The first event happened in the middle of the day. I was downtown with my dad. It was around noon, so the sun was high and everything was bright. Nothing unusual was happening. People were walking around, cars were driving through the streets, businesses were open. It was just an ordinary day. Then I noticed something strange about the light. I remember looking down at my own shadow on the ground. There was a weird tint to everything. Greenish, not bright green like someone had turned on a colored light, but enough of a difference that I immediately noticed it. The daylight just looked wrong. I remember staring at my shadow and trying to understand why everything had that strange color. I looked around. The buildings looked different. The street looked different. The whole environment seemed to have this faint green quality. I turned toward my dad. I started saying something about it. Something like, "Does the light look weird to you?" I barely had time to finish. Suddenly, the entire sky lit up. It became incredibly bright, much brighter than normal daylight. It happened so fast that I instinctively raised my hands to protect my eyes. For a moment, it felt like the sun itself had suddenly become several times brighter. There was no warning, no buildup. 1 second, I was noticing a strange green tint. The next, everything was flooded with intense light. It was bright enough that looking upward was impossible. I remember turning my face away and shielding my eyes. And I was not the only one reacting. People around us immediately panicked. Some crouched down. Others started moving quickly toward buildings. A few people looked like they were trying to take cover. Nobody knew what was happening. There had been no explosion that I remembered hearing. No aircraft screaming overhead. No obvious object in the sky. Just light. Then, almost as quickly as the brightness appeared, everything changed again. The daylight dropped. The entire area became dark. Not nighttime dark. More like dusk. Imagine going from noon to early evening in a second. That was what it felt like. For another moment, the world looked completely wrong. People were still reacting. Some were looking upward. Others were staring at each other. Then the normal daylight returned. Just like that. The whole event lasted maybe 5 or 10 seconds. Possibly even less. It is difficult to judge time accurately when something that strange happens. But it was short. Bright, dark, normal, that was it. My dad and I looked at each other. I remember immediately looking toward the sky. Nothing. No smoke, no trail, no aircraft, no strange cloud. Nothing that explained what had just happened. The sky looked normal again. That was probably the weirdest part. If there had been a massive thunderstorm coming through, maybe it would have made sense if a plane had dropped something. If there had been an explosion. If a power transformer had blown nearby. Anything visible would have helped. But there was nothing. The street slowly returned to normal. People who had crouched down stood up. Those who had moved toward cover stopped. Everyone seemed to be looking around with the same expression. What the hell was that? I do not remember hearing any official explanation afterward. Maybe there was one and I simply missed it. This was before smartphones were everywhere. You could not immediately pull out a phone, record the sky, then search social media for hundreds of other videos. If something strange happened, you might hear about it on local television later. Or maybe not. At 14, I certainly was not doing serious research into atmospheric events. So the incident remained unexplained to me. I thought maybe it had something to do with military testing. Given how much activity we were seeing around the air bases, that seemed possible. But again, that was only a guess. The second strange event happened around the same general period. This time, I was at home. I had gone outside to our driveway because I needed to get something out of the car. Everything seemed normal. Then, I heard a sound in the distance. It was strange enough that I stopped. It sounded almost metallic, a kind of high whine. At first, it was far away. Then it became louder. I looked up. Something was coming toward the house. For a second, I assumed it was an aircraft. That would have been the normal explanation. We saw military aircraft in the area all the time. But as the object came closer, it did not look like any normal plane I recognized. It looked almost like a huge metal torpedo with wings. That is still the best description I can give. Long, metallic, a very simple shape. It definitely did not look like a normal passenger aircraft. And it was moving fast. Really fast. It came over the house at a relatively low altitude, low enough that I could see markings on the side, labels, writing, details on the body. That is one of the reasons I do not think it was a tiny model aircraft. This thing looked large, maybe around the size of a small sedan, possibly larger. I was only 14, so my estimate could have been wrong. Judging the size of something in the sky is difficult without a clear reference, but it was definitely much bigger than the remote-controlled planes I had seen. It flew directly over the house. I stood there, looking up. The metallic whine passed overhead. Then the object continued away. The whole sighting was probably only a few seconds. It moved too quickly to study. But it left a strong impression because the shape seemed so strange. No obvious cockpit, no familiar airplane body, just this long metallic object with wings. Again, because of the timing, my immediate thought was military equipment. Maybe some kind of missile, maybe a drone, maybe a test aircraft. I did not know. I still do not. It might have been something completely ordinary that looked strange because of the angle and speed. Aircraft can be difficult to identify when you see them unexpectedly from below. And at 14, I was definitely not an aviation expert. But I remember standing in the driveway afterward, wondering what I had just watched fly over our house. Between the strange daylight event and the flying object, that whole period began to feel unusual. There was already so much military activity around us. Helicopters, aircraft, news about the coming invasion. Everyone knew the country was preparing for war. So these weird experiences fit naturally into that atmosphere. Maybe they were connected. Maybe not. The third event happened later, during the summer after the initial invasion. This one is easier for me to believe had some kind of military explanation. But at the time, it was by far the most frightening thing I had ever seen in the sky. My grandparents had taken my brother and me down to Los Angeles. We were driving back north afterward. It was late, probably around 10 or 11 at night. We were coming through the Grapevine. Anyone familiar with that area knows how dramatic the landscape can look at night. The highway winds through mountains and foothills. There are long, dark stretches, Cars move in streams through the passes. At night, most of the surrounding land disappears into darkness. You see headlights, taillights, occasional lights from buildings or distant towns. Other than that, the hills become black shapes. We were driving north when someone noticed a bright light in the sky. At first, it looked like a star, nothing special. Then, it started getting brighter. I watched it. It slowly increased in size. I thought maybe it was an airplane coming toward us. That would make sense. An approaching plane can look like a stationary light at first. As it gets closer, the light becomes brighter. So for a little while, nobody panicked. We just kept watching. But the light continued growing and growing. At some point, it became clear that this did not look like a normal aircraft anymore. The brightness kept increasing. The light expanded into a large glowing ball. It looked like it was pulsing, almost like energy was moving through it. The entire thing would brighten, then seem to shift, then brighten again. My brother and I stared. My grandparents were watching too. Other cars on the highway began slowing down. The ball kept growing. It was no longer something you could casually ignore. It dominated the sky. People started pulling over. That was when the fear really began. When you see one person react, maybe they are confused. When dozens of drivers start stopping their cars, you know everyone is seeing the same thing. Vehicles moved on to the shoulder. People got out. They stood beside their cars and looked upward. For a moment, the highway felt like it was experiencing one shared event. Nobody knew what the light was. This was not long after the invasion of Iraq had begun. People were already nervous about war and possible attacks. The idea of terrorism was still very fresh in everyone's mind. So when a gigantic glowing object appeared over California at night, a lot of people naturally assumed the worst. I remember wondering whether we were under attack. Maybe a missile had been launched. Maybe something had exploded in the atmosphere. Maybe this was the beginning of something much larger. The light continued growing. It became bright enough to illuminate the landscape. That is one of the details I remember most. The foothills below us started casting shadows. Think about how bright something in the sky has to be to do that at night. The mountains and slopes that had been almost invisible moments earlier were suddenly being lit from above. We could see shapes, terrain, long shadows. Everyone was staring. Then something happened at the center of the glowing mass. A bright green light appeared. It seemed to explode outward from the middle. The green was vivid, almost artificial looking. Then another wave followed. A ring of pearlescent light expanded outward. It moved much faster than the earlier glow. The ring spread across the sky. It kept growing. The colors were difficult to describe. White, green, almost rainbow-like at the edges. The effect reminded me of light reflecting from the inside of a shell. It was beautiful and terrifying. The ring expanded until the entire thing looked enormous, bigger than the sun would appear in the sky, like some gigantic glowing fireball hanging overhead. For a 14-year-old who had no idea what he was watching, it looked apocalyptic. I remember thinking this might actually be it. Maybe this was some kind of nuclear event. Maybe a missile was coming. Maybe something had detonated. People around us seemed to be thinking the same thing. Cars were stopped. People stood outside. Nobody knew whether to keep driving or take cover. There is something very strange about being surrounded by adults who are also scared. As a kid, you usually assume grown-ups know what is happening. If something strange appears, you look to them. They explain it. Plane, lightning, fireworks, whatever. But that night, people were just staring. The adults did not have answers either. That made everything feel much more serious. The enormous, glowing cloud remained in the sky. It did not disappear immediately. That surprised me. The initial bright event expanded quickly, but afterward the light seemed to hang there for what felt like an incredibly long time. I remember it lingering for close to an hour. Maybe my memory of the exact duration is imperfect. But it definitely did not vanish in seconds. The glowing shape slowly changed. It shimmered, pulsed, spread through the upper atmosphere. The brightness gradually became less intense, but the strange illuminated cloud remained visible. We eventually continued driving. There was nothing else to do. Whatever had happened was far away. We could not control it. I kept looking through the windows as we moved north. The glowing shape was still there. It looked unreal, like something from a science fiction movie. Years later, I came to believe that what we saw was connected to a missile test or missile event from a military facility in the region. That explanation made sense. High-altitude missile exhaust can produce enormous glowing clouds after sunset or at night because sunlight can still hit material at high altitude even when the ground is dark. At 14, I knew none of that. I only knew the sky appeared to be exploding. Even after learning that there was probably a reasonable explanation, the memory stayed frightening. Understanding something later does not erase how it felt while it was happening. That night, we had no explanation. We were driving through dark mountains. A point of light appeared. It grew. It became brighter than anything I expected to see in the night sky. Then, green light exploded from the center. A huge glowing ring spread outward. The landscape lit up. People stopped their cars. For a while, it seemed completely reasonable to believe that something catastrophic was happening. I remember looking at the faces of people standing beside the highway. Everyone was looking upward. Some people were probably excited. Some probably knew exactly what it was. But many looked frightened. And honestly, I cannot blame them. This was 2003. People were living with a very different sense of danger after September 11 and during the beginning of another war. If a giant, unexplained light suddenly filled the sky, nobody's first thought was necessarily going to be, oh, cool atmospheric effect. A lot of minds went directly to attack. Mine certainly did. The strangest thing about all three events is how close together they happened in my memory. First, the daylight changed downtown. Then the strange flying object went over our house. Then months later, the enormous light appeared over the grapevine. Maybe none of those events had anything to do with each other. Most likely, they did not. The first could have been some unusual atmospheric effect. The second could have been an aircraft I simply did not recognize. The third could have been a military missile test producing an unusual high-altitude light display. Three separate explanations. Three separate events. But because they happened during such a tense period, they became linked in my memory. When I think about the beginning of the Iraq War, I do not only remember television news. I remember helicopters. I remember looking up more often. I remember adults discussing military activity. And I remember the sky doing things I had never seen before. The noon event is probably the hardest one for me to explain. I still wonder about the greenish light before everything became bright. Maybe there were thin clouds high in the atmosphere. Maybe some unusual reflection changed the color of sunlight. Maybe something passed between us and the sun. But the sudden brightness, followed by darkness, was dramatic enough that people around us reacted physically. That tells me it was not just my eyes. Other people saw something. They crouched. They ran. They looked for cover. My dad saw it too. Whatever caused it affected the whole street. That is reassuring in one sense. I know I did not imagine the event. But it also makes the lack of an explanation stranger. Maybe it was reported locally. Maybe someone explained it the same afternoon. I simply do not remember. At 14, my priorities were very different. I was not saving newspaper articles or researching scientific causes. The event happened. We talked about it. Then, life continued. The metallic object is similar. I remember enough detail to know it surprised me. But I also know how unreliable size estimates can be. If something is in the sky, you do not know exactly how far away it is. If you do not know distance, you cannot accurately calculate size. What looked as large as a car might have been smaller and closer, or much larger and farther away. The fact that I could see markings makes me think it was relatively low. But again, I have no photograph, no video, no model number, nothing. These were the days before everyone carried a high-quality camera in their pocket. That is almost hard to imagine now. Today, if something strange flew over a neighborhood, 50 people would record it. Someone would upload the video within minutes. People online would identify it. Flight trackers might show where it came from. News organizations could find witnesses. Back then, you just watched. Then it was gone. Your evidence was your memory. That can be frustrating. I realize how crazy some of this sounds when I tell it. A sky that turns green, flashes brighter than daylight, then darkens. A torpedo-shaped object flying over a house. A giant expanding fireball of pearlescent light hanging in the night sky. Put all three together and it sounds like someone writing a UFO story. But I never thought aliens were involved. Even at 14, military activity seemed like the more likely connection. We lived near major bases. The country was preparing for war. We were seeing aircraft constantly. That context matters. Still, military explanation does not automatically mean something is not frightening. Sometimes it is more frightening. The third event proved that. Once I later decided it had probably been a missile-related event, I understood why the sky looked so strange. But at the time, the idea of an actual missile was not comforting. When you see something that powerful from miles away, you realize how much energy is involved. The glowing cloud was huge. The light was strong enough to cast shadows. Whatever produced that display was operating on a scale far beyond anything in normal daily life. At 14, that was overwhelming. I think that night was one of the first times I really understood how small people are compared with military technology. You see missiles on television and they look small because a screen makes everything small. Then you see the effects of one across a huge part of the sky. Suddenly the scale becomes real. It makes you understand why people feared nuclear war for generations. Even if what we saw was harmless, the visual language was the same. Light, expansion, a glowing cloud. People staring upward. It looked like every image of disaster I had ever seen. I remember wondering whether we should get down. Should we keep driving? Was there going to be a shockwave? Would there be another explosion? Nobody knew. Then nothing happened. No blast reached us. No emergency sirens. No attack. The light simply remained in the sky and slowly changed. Eventually, fear became curiosity. People got back into their cars. Traffic moved again. The world did not end. That transition was almost surreal. 1 minute, strangers were standing beside a freeway, believing they might be watching the beginning of some catastrophe. Then, everyone got back into their vehicles and continued driving home. What else could we do? It reminds me how quickly people can move between normal life and genuine fear. That happened during the downtown incident, too. People were walking along normally. Then, the sky flashed. People ducked. Seconds later, daylight returned. Everyone stood back up. The day continued. The world can feel stable until something unexpected happens overhead. Then suddenly you realize how dependent that sense of normality is on the sky behaving the way you expect. Sunlight should stay sunlight. Aircraft should look like aircraft. Stars should not grow into giant pulsing balls. When those rules seem to change, even briefly, fear comes fast. I am much older now, and I can look back with more skepticism. I know there were probably ordinary or military explanations. I do not tell these stories as proof of anything mysterious. I certainly do not think we witnessed aliens or some supernatural event. They were simply unusual experiences that happened during a very unusual period. But I still remember how they felt, especially the last one. I can still picture the grapevine at night. Dark mountains, lines of cars, a point of light growing larger. People slowly realizing it was not an airplane. Cars pulling onto the shoulder, doors opening, families standing beside the highway, everyone staring. Then the green burst, the pearlescent ring, the enormous glowing cloud spreading across the sky. For 14-year-old me, it genuinely looked like the end of the world. Maybe the explanation was completely routine to somebody working at a military base. Maybe technicians somewhere watched the same event on instruments and knew exactly what was happening. But miles away, surrounded by strangers on a highway, we had no idea. And sometimes not knowing is all it takes to make something terrifying. The first two events still remain less clear to me. Maybe one day I will find some old report that explains the daylight flash. Maybe the strange flying object was a known type of military drone or target aircraft. Maybe both were completely unrelated to the war preparations happening around us. I am fine admitting that. Memory is not evidence, especially a memory from when I was 14. But the central experiences are still vivid. I remember the green tint in the daylight. I remember starting to mention it to my dad. I remember shielding my eyes when the sky became painfully bright. I remember the sudden darkness afterward. I remember strangers reacting around us. I remember looking up afterward and finding nothing there. I remember the metallic whine above our driveway. I remember looking up and seeing something long and metal moving low and fast over the house. And I remember sitting in the car on the grapevine while a point of light in the sky grew into something enormous. Maybe they were all explainable. Probably. But explainable does not mean unimpressive. And it definitely does not mean they were not scary. At 14, during a period when the entire country seemed tense and war was constantly on television, those events felt connected to something much larger than me. Every helicopter overhead reminded us that something was happening. Every strange aircraft made us look twice. And when the sky itself seemed to explode, for a few minutes there was no difference between a military test and the beginning of an attack. All you could do was stare. That summer eventually ended. The invasion became old news. The unusual amount of military activity seemed to fade. Daily life returned to normal. But those three experiences stayed with me. Even now, when I see videos of strange missile exhaust clouds or unusual atmospheric events, I think back to that night on the grapevine. Sometimes I finally recognize pieces of what I saw. The expanding light, the colors, the glowing cloud. That gives me a little more understanding. But I also remember what it was like without that knowledge. The fear, the confusion, the adults getting out of cars, the strange silence of people watching something they could not explain. That is probably why the experience remains so powerful. Today, somebody would pull out a smartphone. Within minutes, there would be posts explaining exactly what military launch everyone had seen. A live map would show where it came from. People would argue about it online before the cloud even disappeared. Back then, we had none of that. We had a dark highway, a glowing sky, and our own imaginations. Sometimes that was much scarier. So no, I would not call any of these events paranormal. I would not even call them completely unexplained. At least the last one almost certainly had a real-world cause. But to 14-year-old me, none of that mattered. I saw daylight turn green, explode into blinding brightness, then fall dark. I watched a strange metal object scream over my house. And a few months later, I stood beneath a massive, pulsing light that seemed to spread across the night sky, while people around me prepared themselves for what they thought might be an attack. Maybe all of it was ordinary military or atmospheric activity. But standing there without an explanation, it was scary as hell. This happened to my stepdad's parents a few years ago. At the time, they were living in an apartment complex in a pretty rough area. It was not the kind of place where strange noises outside at night were completely unusual. People came and went at odd hours. Arguments happened in the parking lot. Cars would pull in and out late. Sometimes there were people around who clearly did not belong there. They were older, though, and they had lived long enough that most things did not bother them much. They were not the type to panic over every sound. If someone was yelling outside, they ignored it. If a car alarm went off, they waited for it to stop. If somebody knocked late at night, they usually assumed it was someone at the wrong apartment. That attitude probably explains part of what happened. One night, sometime around 3 in the morning, they were asleep when they heard someone at the front of their apartment. At first, I think it was just noise. Then it became clear that somebody was banging on the screen door. Not lightly knocking, banging, hard enough to wake them up. At 3 in the morning, that alone would have been enough to scare most people. When someone comes to your home at that hour, there are very few good reasons for it. Maybe there's an emergency. Maybe somebody needs help. Or maybe somebody is drunk, angry, confused, or dangerous. My stepdad's parents did not immediately get up and answer. They stayed inside. They listened. The man kept banging. They did not recognize the voice, if he said anything at all. They did not know who he was. They had no reason to open the door. So they ignored him. Their thinking was simple. If they did not respond, eventually he would get bored and leave. They did not call the police, partly because they were stubborn, partly because they were old enough that they had reached that stage where they did not want to deal with anybody unless absolutely necessary. They were basically like, let the idiot bang on the door. He will leave. That sounds funny when you say it afterward. At the time, though, there was a stranger standing outside their home in the middle of the night. They were just hoping he stayed outside. At some point, they managed to get a look at him. Maybe through a window. Maybe through a gap in the blinds. They saw enough to remember a few details. He was bald. He was standing out on the front porch. And he was smoking cigarettes. That image is what makes the story especially creepy to me. A random bald man standing outside an elderly couple's apartment at 3 in the morning, smoking cigarettes and banging on their door. Not in a hurry, not running away, just hanging around like he had all the time in the world. There is something deeply unsettling about someone who does not seem nervous while doing something clearly wrong. If a person is trying to break in, you expect them to move quickly. If they are drunk and at the wrong apartment, maybe they eventually realize their mistake and leave. But this guy stayed. He smoked. He banged on the screen door. He waited. It sounds like he wanted them to know he was there. That would have made me call the police immediately. They did not. Again, that was just their personality. They were not interested in turning it into a bigger situation unless he actually tried to come inside. So they stayed quiet. They did not answer. They did not open the door. They did not confront him. Eventually, the banging stopped. For a while, they probably kept listening. When you are lying in bed and a stranger has been standing outside your home, the silence afterward does not immediately feel safe. You wonder whether he actually left. Maybe he is still on the porch. Maybe he moved around the side of the apartment. Maybe he is waiting near a window. Maybe he is sitting outside smoking another cigarette. But after enough time passed without more noise, they decided he was gone. Eventually, they went back to sleep. That part has always sounded crazy to me. I understand they were tired. I understand they did not want to spend the whole night worrying. But if it had been me, I do not think I would have slept at all. I would have been watching the front door until sunrise, but they managed to go back to bed. Morning came. The apartment looked normal. Daylight has a way of changing how frightening a place feels. At 3 in the morning, a porch can look like the edge of nowhere. In the morning, it is just a porch again. Neighbors are moving around. Cars are starting. People are going to work. Everything feels ordinary. They got up and started their day. At some point, they went to inspect the front porch. Maybe they wanted to see whether the man had left cigarette butts behind. Maybe they were curious whether there was any sign he had actually been there. Maybe they wanted to check the screen door for damage. That was when they saw something sitting on the table outside. A knife. And not a small pocket knife. A huge knife. The kind of thing you notice immediately. It was sitting there on the porch table. There was no reasonable explanation for it being there. It had not belonged to them. They had not left it outside. The only stranger who had been standing on that porch during the night was the bald man. So, as far as they were concerned, the knife had come from him. That changed the whole situation. Suddenly, everything from the night before became more threatening. Before finding the knife, they could tell themselves the man had simply been drunk. Maybe he thought he knew someone who lived there. Maybe he had the wrong apartment. Maybe he was just some strange guy looking for cigarettes or money. The knife made those explanations harder to accept. Because now they had to ask what he had been doing with it. Had it been in his hand while he was banging? Had it been in his pocket? Had he put it on the table before knocking? Had he intentionally left it behind? That last possibility was the one nobody liked thinking about. Maybe it was a warning. Maybe he wanted them to find it. Maybe he was saying, without words, that he could come back. Or maybe it was completely accidental. Maybe he had set it down while smoking and forgotten it when he left. That is possible. People do stupid things, especially if they are drunk or high. Maybe the knife was something he carried for protection. Maybe it had nothing to do with the people inside the apartment at all. But even the accidental explanation is not exactly comforting. A stranger with a large knife had been standing outside their door at 3 in the morning. Whether he intended to use it or not, it had been there. That is enough. I do not know exactly what kind of knife it was. I do not want to exaggerate details that I was not there to personally see. All I know is that they described it as huge. Large enough that finding it on the porch the next morning was immediately alarming. It was not something you could mistake for a butter knife someone dropped during dinner. It looked like a weapon, and it had been left where the man had spent the night banging on their door. That is terrifying, because it makes you rethink the decision not to answer. What if they had opened the screen door? What if one of them had stepped outside and told him to leave? Would he have used the knife? Maybe not. Maybe he would have apologized and walked away. But there is no way to know. And when someone has already come to your home in the middle of the night carrying something like that, you do not want to test their intentions. The screen door also matters. A screen door is not much of a barrier. It gives you a little separation, but not real protection. Someone determined could break through one easily. The solid front door behind it was what actually kept them safe. The thought of that man standing on the other side, smoking, knowing two elderly people were inside, is hard to shake. Maybe he was waiting for someone to open up. Maybe he hoped they would come outside to confront him. Maybe the banging was meant to provoke them. That possibility is worse than him simply trying to get their attention. Because if he wanted a reaction, then ignoring him may have been exactly what saved them. He did not get what he wanted. Eventually, he left. I have always wondered what was going through their minds when they saw the knife. There must have been a moment where everything stopped. You see it. You remember the banging. You remember the bald head outside. You remember the cigarette glow. Then you connect the two. That man was standing here. That knife was here with him. Suddenly, the night becomes much more serious than it felt while it was happening. I think that is one of the scariest things about human threats. Sometimes you do not understand how much danger you were in until later. During the event, you are only reacting to what you know. A stranger is knocking. Fine, ignore him. He will leave. Then, the next morning, you discover information that completely changes the picture. He had a knife. Now the same banging sounds different in your memory. The waiting feels different. The smoking feels different. Even the fact that he eventually left becomes disturbing. Why did he leave? Did he get tired? Did he hear something? Did he realize nobody was going to answer? Did somebody else come outside nearby? Or had he never planned to do anything at all? There is no answer. My stepdad's parents never found out who he was, at least not as far as I know. He was not someone they recognized from the apartment complex. He was not a neighbor who later apologized for getting the wrong door. Nobody came asking for the knife. There was no explanation, just a stranger in the middle of the night. Then, the knife. That was enough for them. They eventually moved out. I cannot blame them. Once something like that happens, a home can stop feeling like a home. Before, the apartment might have been in a bad area, but it was still their place. Their door, their porch, their bed, their routine. Afterward, every noise at night probably sounded different. Every person passing outside became worth checking. Every knock had the possibility of being him again. Even if he never came back, he had changed the way the apartment felt. That sense of safety is hard to restore. People sometimes focus on whether the knife was intentionally left as a threat. I do not know. It is tempting to imagine that he placed it on the table deliberately. That makes the story more sinister. But the truth is, it could have been an accident. Maybe he had been drinking and forgot it. Maybe he sat it down while lighting a cigarette. Maybe he was carrying several things and left one behind. But that does not make the situation harmless. It only changes the reason the knife was there. The important part is that the man apparently had access to it during the encounter, and he had been standing outside the home of two elderly people at 3 in the morning. That is enough to make me uncomfortable. The fact that he was smoking cigarettes sticks with me too. Maybe because it gives the scene a calmness it should not have. He was not pounding once and running away. He stayed long enough to smoke. That suggests time. Patience. He was comfortable standing there. Maybe he knew no one was going to challenge him. Maybe he was watching the windows. Maybe he could tell they were awake. When somebody is banging loudly on your door at 3 in the morning, they know they have woken you up. The lights might come on. Curtains move. They may hear footsteps inside. He probably knew they were there. And yet he stayed. That is the part that feels deliberate. He wanted something. We just do not know what. Maybe money. Maybe alcohol. Maybe he was looking for another person. Maybe he had the wrong apartment. Maybe he wanted to scare them. Or maybe he had much worse intentions. There is no way to know because they never opened the door. Again, that was probably the best decision they made. Do not engage. Do not step outside. Do not give the stranger access. Wait. Let him leave. It is easy to criticize them for not calling the police immediately. Personally, I would have called. But older people sometimes have a different attitude toward situations like that. They may have lived through enough strange neighborhoods and enough late-night nonsense that one more drunk banging on a door does not immediately seem like an emergency. They also may not want police involved unless someone is actually breaking in. And in the end, nothing happened to them. The man left. But finding that knife made it clear how easily the story could have ended differently. I wonder whether the man ever realized he forgot it. If it was accidental, imagine him waking up the next day and noticing it was gone. Would he remember where he left it? Would he think about going back? That thought alone would make me want to move. Even after he was gone, he might know exactly where the apartment was. If the knife mattered to him, maybe he would return. Maybe not. But once your mind starts asking those questions, every night becomes stressful. There is also the possibility that the knife was not forgotten. Maybe leaving it was the entire point. A message. A way to say, I was here. That interpretation is impossible to prove. But if I had been living there, I would have thought about it every time I locked the door. Did he leave it because they ignored him? Was he angry? Was he planning to come back? Did he want them to know what he had been carrying? A weapon can communicate something without anyone saying a word. That is why finding it after the fact feels so disturbing. During the night, they never saw it. If they had, they probably would have called police immediately. Instead, they discovered it only after the danger had passed. It is almost like receiving a warning from the previous night. You thought that was creepy? You had no idea. I also think about how close the man was to them. People tell stories about being watched from across a street or followed by a car. This guy was standing directly outside their front door. One layer of wall and a lock separated them. If he had tried to force his way in, everything would have changed instantly. He never did. At least, not beyond banging on the screen door. That is why the story remains more mysterious than violent. There was potential, not action. And sometimes potential is enough to scare you. A threatening person does not actually have to attack for you to understand what could have happened. The knife makes that potential visible. It becomes the physical representation of everything they avoided by keeping the door closed. I am also glad they did not go outside after he left. Imagine if the banging stopped and one of them immediately opened the door to see where he went. Maybe he was still standing around the corner. Maybe he had only moved out of sight. Maybe the knife was still with him. They waited. They went back to sleep. Only in daylight did they inspect the porch. That gave them distance from whatever he had wanted. There is no supernatural element to this story. No ghost, no strange voice, no figure disappearing, nothing impossible. And honestly, I think that is what makes it effective. Human beings are unpredictable. A man does not have to be a monster to be dangerous. All it takes is the wrong person at the wrong door at the wrong time. Maybe this guy was harmless. Maybe he was drunk and confused. Maybe he had no intention of hurting anyone. But you cannot know that while he is standing outside at 3 a.m. with a large knife somewhere near him. That uncertainty is the danger. My stepdad's parents were lucky enough not to find out what he wanted. He eventually stopped banging. He left. The apartment became quiet. They survived the night without confrontation. Then morning revealed what had been sitting on the porch. A huge knife. Whether it was a warning, an accident, or something else, nobody ever figured out. They did not wait around for a second visit. They moved out. And honestly, I would have done exactly the same thing. Because once you know that an unknown man stood outside your home in the middle of the night, smoking cigarettes, pounding on your door, and apparently carrying a knife large enough to make you remember it years later, the question of what he wanted becomes less important than the fact that you never want him coming back. I was 20 years old at the time, living and working in Colorado. I had a job as a chairlift operator at Beaver Creek Resort, which at that age felt like a pretty good way to spend part of my life. I was living with a few friends from high school, and one of them worked at the same resort as I did. We were young, far from home, working, hanging out, and not really thinking too much about anything beyond whatever was happening that week. Then one day, everything changed. My friend called me on the house phone. I still remember the tone of his voice. He told me that Kevin, one of our very close friends back home, had died. That was all we knew. No details, no explanation, just that Kevin was dead. There are certain pieces of news your brain refuses to accept immediately. You hear the words, but they do not connect. Kevin was our age. He was someone we had grown up with, someone we had laughed with, someone who was supposed to still be there the next time we went home. Death was something that happened to older relatives or people on the news, not Kevin. For a while, I think both of us just kept asking the same questions. What happened? Was there an accident? Was he sick? Had somebody hurt him? Nobody could give us an answer. All we knew was that one of our closest friends was gone. We knew immediately that we had to go home. There was no question. Whatever work schedules we had did not matter anymore. We talked to whoever we needed to talk to, got off work, packed what we could, and started driving back toward the Midwest. It was a long trip. Colorado to home was not something you casually drove in an hour or two. We had a lot of road ahead of us, and that gave us far too much time to think. The entire drive felt strange. There were long stretches where neither of us said much. Then, one of us would remember something Kevin had done and bring it up. A joke, a stupid night from high school, some argument that seemed important at the time and completely meaningless now. Then we would go quiet again. Grief is strange when you do not yet know what happened. You are sad, but you are also confused. Part of your brain keeps waiting for someone to call and say there has been a mistake. Maybe Kevin was injured. Maybe someone misunderstood. Maybe he was still alive somewhere. But as the miles passed, that hope became harder to hold on to. Eventually, we reached our hometown. We did not even really settle in first. We went directly to my friend Dan's house. Dan had been Kevin's roommate, so naturally everyone was gathering there. By the time we arrived, several of our friends were already inside. The house had that strange feeling homes get after someone dies unexpectedly. There were people everywhere, but nobody was acting normal. Some were sitting quietly. Some were drinking. Some were telling stories. Some were laughing at memories and then suddenly crying a few minutes later. Kevin's name came up constantly. It was like everyone was trying to keep him present by talking about him. That was also when we finally started learning more about what had happened. Apparently, Kevin had been found hanging from a tree in a local park. There was still confusion surrounding the circumstances. People were trying to understand what had led to his death. There were questions. Rumors shocked nobody, and that house seemed to have a complete picture yet. I do not want to pretend I knew exactly what happened or what Kevin had been thinking. At the time, we simply knew that our friend had died in a way none of us had expected. That was difficult enough. The night went on. Nobody wanted to sleep. I think going to bed would have made everything too quiet. As long as everyone stayed together and talked about Kevin, We could avoid being alone with our thoughts. By around 1 in the morning, I was standing in Dan's kitchen. There were maybe 6 of us in there. We were talking. I do not remember exactly what story we were telling. Probably something about Kevin. Almost everything was about him that night. Then, my cell phone rang. At first, that was not strange. People knew we had come home. Friends and family were calling. Information was being passed around. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. Then I looked at the caller ID. Kevin. For a moment, my brain did not understand. I just stared at the screen. His name was right there. Kevin was calling me. I remember showing the phone to the people standing around me. Conversation stopped. Everyone looked. Nobody laughed. Nobody said anything clever. We all knew Kevin was dead. We had been standing there discussing his death. And now his name was glowing on my phone. I felt this cold disbelief move through me. There had to be an explanation. Maybe someone had his phone. That was the obvious answer. Maybe Dan had it. Maybe a family member had found it. Maybe one of our friends had gotten access to it and was pulling some horrible prank. Kevin himself had always been a prankster. He loved messing with people, especially me. So part of my brain immediately tried to turn the call into some elaborate joke. But that did not make sense. Kevin was gone. I hesitated. Then I answered. I put the phone to my ear. Nothing, no voice, no breathing, no background noise that I remember, just silence. I said something. Probably hello? Nothing, I listened. Still nothing. The people around me were staring. I had no idea what to do. Eventually, the call ended. I lowered the phone. The whole kitchen felt different after that. Before the call, we had been grieving. Now there was this additional layer of confusion. Somebody asked what I heard. I told them there had been nothing, only silence. We started trying to explain it. Maybe his phone had somehow dialed me accidentally. Maybe someone had found it and pressed something. Maybe his number had been spoofed, though at the time that was not something I really knew much about. Maybe there was some strange network issue. There had to be a normal explanation. And honestly, there probably was. Phones do weird things. Contacts can display names based on stored numbers. Someone could have had Kevin's phone. The call itself did not prove anything supernatural, but the timing was terrible. 1 in the morning, a room full of people talking about Kevin. Then Kevin's name appears on my phone, and when I answer, there's nobody there. It scared the hell out of me. I kept thinking about what Kevin was like when he was alive. He loved pranks. He loved getting reactions. For some reason, I seemed to be one of his favorite targets. He knew exactly how to push my buttons. If there was any way he could have arranged one final joke from beyond the grave, that would have been completely in character. I know how crazy that sounds. At the time, though, humor was one of the only ways I could handle it. I told myself it was Kevin messing with me. One last prank. It was easier than admitting I had no idea what happened. The next day was difficult. Everyone was preparing for the funeral. There were people to see, family members to talk to, stories being repeated again and again. The reality of Kevin's death was starting to settle in. The phone call remained in the back of my mind, but I tried not to focus on it. There was too much else happening. The night before the funeral, I was staying at my parents' house. Since I had come home suddenly from Colorado, I took the opportunity to do some laundry. My parents lived in an older house. The basement was unfinished. Cold concrete. Exposed parts of the house. That particular smell old basements have. Even during the day, it was not the most comfortable place. At night, it was worse. There were not bright ceiling fixtures everywhere. One of the lights had to be turned on and off using a pull string. You would reach up, grab the cord, pull it, and hear the bulb click. Simple, normal, but there is something about unfinished basements that already puts your imagination in the wrong place. The ceiling feels low, shadows collect in corners. The furnace makes sounds. Pipes knock. Every little noise echoes. That night, I went downstairs by myself. I had a load of laundry going. I was moving clothes from the washing machine into the dryer. Nothing about that should have been frightening. I had been in that basement hundreds of times. It was my parents' house. I knew the space. But because of everything that had happened over the previous couple of days, my mind was on Kevin. I kept thinking about him. Old memories. High school. Things we had done. His jokes. His personality. How strange it was that he was not alive anymore. That is one of the hardest parts after losing someone. Your brain can remember them perfectly. Their voice, their laugh, the way they would respond to something. You can almost hear them, but you also know they are gone. I finished moving the laundry. Then I reached up for the pull string. I gave it a tug. Click, the light went out. The basement became completely dark, pitch black. That was normal. I had done it before. The staircase was not far away. All I had to do was turn and walk toward the door. I turned, and right beside my right ear, only inches away, I heard a whisper. "You can't see me now." I froze. There are moments when fear makes you jump. Then there are moments when fear shuts your body down completely. This was the second kind. For a second, I could not move. The whisper had been close. Not across the room. Not at the top of the stairs. Right behind me. Beside my ear. Close enough that if a person had spoken there, their face would have been right next to mine. And I knew that voice. It was Kevin. I do not mean that it vaguely reminded me of him. I mean I heard my friend's voice. The same friend whose funeral I was going to attend the next day. "You can't see me now." The words themselves were exactly the kind of thing he would have said. That made it worse. Or maybe better. I still do not know. Kevin had always messed with me. He enjoyed scaring people. He liked getting reactions. If he could have watched me standing alone in a dark basement and chosen one sentence to say, that was the kind of sentence he would have picked. "You can't see me now." For a few seconds, I was completely locked in place. Every hair on my body seemed to stand up at once. Cold shivers shot up my spine. My heart slammed against my chest. I was afraid to turn around. I knew logically there should not be anyone behind me. I had been alone in the basement. I had not heard anyone come down the stairs. But after that whisper, logic did not matter. Some part of me expected Kevin to be standing there in the dark, or something that looked like him. I did not wait. The shock broke. I ran. I went up those stairs as fast as I possibly could. I do not remember turning the basement light back on. I do not remember caring about the laundry. I just wanted to get upstairs. My mother was in the living room. I came rushing in, probably looking completely terrified. I tried to explain what happened. I told her I had been in the basement. I turned out the light. Then I heard Kevin whisper directly behind me. "You can't see me now." I do not remember exactly how she reacted. She probably tried to calm me down. I was grieving. I was exhausted. I had traveled a long distance. The funeral was the next day. My mind had been focused on Kevin constantly. There were plenty of normal reasons I might have imagined hearing his voice. Grief can do strange things. People who lose someone often report thinking they hear them. A familiar voice can be so deeply stored in your memory that the brain can recreate it with surprising clarity. Maybe that was what happened. Maybe a sound from the furnace or pipes formed words, because I was already thinking about Kevin. Maybe someone upstairs said something and the acoustics carried it strangely. Maybe my brain supplied the rest. Those are all possible, but the timing still gets me. The light clicked off. Pitch darkness. I turned toward the exit. Then, you can't see me now. Not a random sentence. Not my name. Not something vague. A joke about the fact that I had just turned off the light. That is the part I have never been able to fully dismiss. The phone call had already happened the night before. Kevin's name appeared on my phone while we were talking about him. Silence on the other end. Then, one day later, while I was alone and thinking about him, I heard his voice. Maybe the two incidents were completely unrelated. Maybe the first was a phone glitch. Maybe the second was grief. Statistically, strange coincidences happen. I understand that. But emotionally, it felt like Kevin. And because of who he was, it almost felt appropriate. He had been a prankster in life. Why would death stop him? That was the thought that kept coming back. He was messing with me one last time. Not trying to hurt me. Not trying to scare me in some evil way. Just being Kevin. There is something oddly comforting about that interpretation. The basement incident terrified me in the moment. I was genuinely shaken. But afterward, once the fear faded, I started thinking about the words differently. You can't see me now. If the voice really was Kevin, maybe it was not a threat. Maybe it was a joke. A perfect joke, honestly. He knew I would lose my mind. He knew I would run upstairs. I could almost imagine him laughing. That was Kevin. That was the friend I remembered. I still went to the funeral the next day. That was difficult. Seeing everyone together. Seeing his family. Seeing the people who loved him. The phone call and the whisper were strange, but they did not change the reality that he was gone. There is a big difference between having an experience that feels like someone's presence and having the person physically back in your life. Kevin was still dead. We still had to say goodbye. The funeral made that painfully clear. Afterward, life slowly moved forward. I eventually returned to Colorado. Work resumed. The chairlift kept running. Snow came and went. People moved. Friendships changed. That is what happens. But I never forgot those 2 nights. The phone call in Dan's kitchen and the whisper in my parents' basement. I have replayed both events countless times. The phone call is easier to explain. Someone could have had Kevin's phone. Maybe one of his belongings was being handled and his number dialed accidentally. Maybe there was some network error. Without records, I cannot know. There is no reason to treat that call as proof of anything. But the fact that 6 or so of my friends saw Kevin's name on the screen is important to me. I did not dream that part. Other people witnessed it. I showed them the phone before I answered. We all saw the name. Then I heard silence. The basement was different because I was alone. Nobody else heard the whisper. That means the experience depends entirely on my perception. And I know perception can be influenced by grief. I had been thinking about Kevin right before it happened. My brain could have been primed to interpret a sound as his voice. That is probably what a skeptical person would say. I cannot prove them wrong. But I can tell you what it felt like. It did not feel like a thought. It did not feel like remembering something Kevin had once said. It sounded external. Close, a whisper beside my right ear. I reacted physically before I had time to analyze it. The fear was immediate because my brain believed someone was standing behind me. I did not think. I imagined Kevin saying something. I thought Kevin just spoke behind me. That distinction matters when you are the person experiencing it. Whether it matters objectively is another question. I have also wondered whether the darkness played a role. The second the light went out, my senses shifted. When you cannot see, your hearing becomes more important. A tiny sound seems louder. Maybe my clothes moved. Maybe something in the laundry shifted. Maybe a machine made a sound. The brain is very good at turning unclear sounds into meaningful language, especially when you are stressed. And I was under enormous emotional stress. That explanation is reasonable. Still, I keep coming back to the sentence. You can't see me now. It matched the moment too perfectly. If I had heard something random like my name, I could dismiss it more easily. If I heard laughter, same thing. But the voice commented directly on the darkness. That is what keeps the memory alive. It is also the reason I think of the incident with more affection now than fear. At the time, I was terrified. Years later, when I think about Kevin's personality, I almost smile. Of course that would be the thing he said. Of course he would wait until I turned off the light. Of course he would choose the basement. Of course he would get one final reaction out of me. That was exactly his sense of humor. Maybe that is only my way of processing grief. Maybe I took two strange coincidences and turned them into a last goodbye because I needed one. There would be nothing wrong with that. People cope with loss in different ways. Some dream about the person they lost. Some feel their presence. Some hear familiar songs at meaningful times. Some find comfort in coincidences. Maybe my mind gave me Kevin one last time. If so, I am okay with that. But I also cannot completely shake the feeling that something else happened. The timing was simply too strange. We learn Kevin has died. We drive across several states to come home. We gather in his roommate's kitchen and talk about him. My phone rings. Kevin's name. Silence the next night. I am alone in a dark basement thinking about him. His voice whispers directly beside me. You can't see me now. Then nothing. No more strange events. That last part matters too. Since then, I have never had anything similar happen. No more phone calls from dead friends. No voices in dark rooms. No objects moving. No figures. Nothing. The experiences started immediately after Kevin died. Then stopped. If I were someone who regularly heard voices or experienced strange things, I might interpret the basement differently. But I do not. This was isolated. That makes it stand out. I have never considered myself particularly sensitive to paranormal things. I do not walk into old houses and feel spirits. I do not see ghosts everywhere. I do not spend my life searching for signs. This simply happened. Twice. During one of the worst weeks of my life. Maybe grief explains it completely. Maybe not. I remember talking with friends afterward about the phone call. Everyone had theories. Some thought someone was messing with us. Others found it creepy. I do not remember anyone having a satisfying answer. I also wondered whether Kevin had somehow arranged a prank before he died. That would have been incredibly elaborate, and there was no evidence for it. But it fit his personality enough that I considered it. Maybe he had scheduled something. Maybe someone else knew a joke he wanted played on me. Again, there was nothing to support that. It was simply my brain trying to find a Kevin-like explanation. Because accepting a supernatural explanation felt easier if I could still imagine him smiling. The basement experience was impossible to share without sounding crazy. I knew that. Even when I tried to tell my mom, I could hear how it sounded. I turned off a light while grieving and heard my dead friend's voice. That is exactly the kind of thing people explain as stress. And maybe they are right. But when you are standing in the darkness and hear someone you know whisper 2 inches from your ear, you do not care about psychological explanations. You run. I ran. I ran like Kevin was chasing me up those stairs. If he really was there somehow, he probably would have loved that. Sometimes I think that is the best way to remember it. Not as a haunting, not as something evil, not as proof of life after death. Just one last prank from a friend who loved messing with me. Because if there was any person I knew who would find a way to frighten me after dying, it would have been Kevin. I still miss him. That part never really disappears. You get older. The loss becomes easier to carry. But then, something reminds you. A song. A place. A joke. Someone with the same mannerism. And suddenly, the person is right back in your mind. I have no idea what Kevin would be doing today if he were alive. Maybe we would still be close. Maybe life would have taken us in different directions. I wish I could know. Instead, what I have are memories. And among those memories are two experiences I cannot fully explain. The first happened around 1 in the morning in a kitchen filled with grieving friends. My cell phone rang. The caller ID said Kevin. Everyone saw it. I answered. Silence, the second, happened the following night. I was alone in my parents' unfinished basement. I moved laundry from the washer to the dryer. I thought about my friend. I pulled the string. The light clicked off. I turned toward the door. Then, inches from my right ear, I heard his voice. "You can't see me now." I froze. Then I ran upstairs. That was it. Nothing strange has happened to me since. Maybe the phone call was technology. Maybe the whisper was grief. Maybe both incidents were coincidences that happened at exactly the wrong time. I am willing to accept those possibilities. But deep down, there is a part of me that has always preferred another explanation. Kevin had spent years screwing with me. He loved getting a reaction. He knew exactly how to scare me. And somehow, in the days before we buried him, he managed to get me one final time. Honestly, that would have been exactly like him. When I was around 12 years old, I had a sleepover at a friend's house. Nothing about the night was supposed to be scary. It was just one of those normal childhood sleepovers where you stay up too late, talk about random things, eat junk food, and eventually try to sleep somewhere that is not your own bed. My friend had a cat that had recently had kittens. There were several of them in the house, and because they were still very young, they were constantly moving around, climbing on things, getting into places they should not be, and generally being impossible to ignore. At first, I thought they were adorable. Of course I did. I was 12. A house full of kittens sounded great. That opinion changed a little once I actually tried to go to sleep. There were 4 of them in the room with us. By the time the lights were off and everyone was settling down, those kittens apparently decided that I was the most interesting thing in the room. They climbed on me. They walked across my legs. One crawled near my face. Another tried to get under the blanket. Every time I moved one away, another one seemed to replace it. At first, I was laughing. Then, I was mildly annoyed. Then I became exhausted. I remember lying there thinking that I just wanted to sleep. I was at that stage where my eyes were heavy and my body felt tired, but every few seconds a tiny set of paws would land somewhere on me and wake me back up. It was a huge pain. I did not want to make a big deal out of it because I was a guest. I did not want to wake everyone else or complain, so I kept trying to ignore them. Eventually, I started drifting in and out of sleep. That is probably important. I was definitely tired, maybe extremely tired. The room was dark. My mind was not fully awake anymore. That gives the whole story a very easy explanation. Maybe I dreamed part of it. Maybe I experienced that weird half-awake state where things around you become mixed with dreams. I have thought about that many times. But at the time, what happened felt completely normal. I remember hearing someone come into the room. I did not hear a loud door open or anything dramatic. I just became aware of someone entering. There was movement. Then, one by one, the kittens were lifted off me. I felt the weight disappear. One kitten gone, then another, then another. The little paws stopped moving across my blanket. The room became calmer. Whoever had come in seemed to gather all 4 kittens and take them away. I was so tired that I did not really question it. My first thought was that my friend's mother had noticed the kittens bothering us and had come to collect them. That made perfect sense. She was the adult in the house. Maybe she had heard us moving around. Maybe she knew the kittens were being annoying. Maybe this happened all the time. I did not even fully sit up. I just turned my head slightly. I looked over my shoulder, and I said something like, "Thanks for a brief moment." I saw the person leaving the room. It was a woman, tall, very thin. Lanky, she had long, dark hair. I only saw her from behind. It was not a clear, detailed look. I did not see her face. I did not study her clothing. I did not stare long enough to memorize anything. I was half asleep. The image lasted maybe a second. Then, she was gone from view. I remember thinking that she did not look like my friend's mother. My friend's mother was short and blonde. The woman I saw was tall and had long, dark hair. That difference registered in my mind immediately. But I was exhausted enough that I did not panic. I did not sit up and scream. I did not wake my friend. I did not go searching through the house. I simply thought my tired eyes had confused something. Maybe the darkness made her look taller. Maybe her hair looked dark because the room was dim. Maybe I had only seen a coat, a shadow, or some strange combination of movement and sleepiness. It did not seem worth worrying about. More importantly, the kittens were gone. For the first time in what felt like forever, I could actually sleep. So I did. I rolled over. The room was quiet. And I went back to sleep. The next morning, I woke up and did not immediately think about what had happened. Daylight changes everything. The room looked completely normal. My friend was there. The house was quiet. Nothing seemed wrong. The kittens were somewhere else. For a while, the whole nighttime moment felt almost unimportant. Then, my friend's mother came through the front door. That caught my attention. She had apparently been working a night shift. I did not know or had forgotten that she would be gone all night. I saw her come in from outside, and because I remembered the kittens, I casually thanked her. I said something like, "Thanks for taking the kittens last night." I expected her to know exactly what I meant. Instead, she looked at me completely confused. She asked what I was talking about. I explained that the kittens had been climbing all over me while I was trying to sleep. Then, someone came into the room and picked them up. I told her I thought it had been her. Her expression did not change to recognition. She told me she had not done it. She had just gotten home from work. She had been gone all night. That was the moment the memory from the night before changed completely. Until then, I had filed it away as something normal. An adult came in, removed the kittens. I was half asleep and saw her badly. End of story. Now that explanation disappeared. My friend's mother had not been in the house, at least not during the time I remembered someone entering the room. I immediately started thinking about the woman again. Tall, lanky, long, dark hair. The back of her head, the way she moved away from the bed. I had assumed my eyes were playing tricks on me because the person did not look like my friend's mum. Now I realized maybe the person had not been her at all. That was when I started feeling uneasy. I do not remember exactly how my friend reacted. Maybe she thought I had dreamed it. That would have been a reasonable response. Honestly, that is probably the explanation most people would choose. I was 12. I was very tired. I had been falling asleep. Sleep does strange things to perception. It is entirely possible that the kittens moved away on their own, and my brain created the image of a woman taking them. Or maybe one kitten jumped down, Then another followed, and my half-asleep mind turned that into someone picking them up. The human brain is very good at creating a complete story from incomplete information, especially during that strange period between sleeping and waking. That is probably the explanation I would give if someone else told me this story. But the memory feels different from a dream. That is the problem. I remember the physical sensation of the kittens being lifted off me. I remember becoming aware that someone was in the room. I remember turning my head. I remember saying thank you. And I remember seeing the woman from behind. It was brief, but it felt like something I saw with open eyes. I did not wake up afterward and think, what a weird dream. I simply went back to sleep because I believed something normal had happened. That detail has always mattered to me. When something frightening happens in a dream, usually the fear is immediate. This was not frightening until the next morning. At the time, I thought I understood everything. The kittens were bothering me. An adult came in. The adult removed them. I thanked her. That was it. Only after learning that my friend's mother had been away did the whole event become strange. That kind of delayed fear is different. It makes you go back through the memory and examine details you ignored before. Why was the woman so tall? Why did she have dark hair? Why did I not think that was strange enough to wake up fully? Where did she take the kittens? Who else was in the house? Those questions appeared, one after another. I started thinking about whether another adult could have been there. Maybe a relative, an older sister, a neighbor, someone my friend's family knew. That would solve everything. If another woman was staying in the house, then there was no mystery at all. But as far as I knew, there was nobody like that. The woman I saw did not match anyone I expected to be there. And if some unfamiliar adult had been walking around the house at night, I feel like my friend or her mother would have mentioned it. Still, I cannot say with absolute certainty that nobody else was around. This happened when I was young. Maybe there was a family member I did not know well. Maybe someone came over. Maybe I forgot details. Memory becomes less precise with time. I do not want to turn a strange childhood moment into something more certain than it really was. The kittens themselves are another part I think about. Animals often behave in ways people interpret as paranormal. A cat stares at an empty corner. A dog growls at a doorway. People immediately say the animal sees a ghost. Usually, there is probably a normal explanation. Animals hear sounds we do not. They smell things we cannot. They notice tiny movements. But in this case, I do not remember the kittens reacting fearfully. That is interesting. If some strange woman really entered the room and picked them up, they apparently allowed it. I do not remember scratching. Hissing, running, they just disappeared from the bed one at a time. That could support the idea that a familiar person picked them up. Or maybe it supports nothing. They were kittens. Someone could probably scoop them up easily. I wish I remembered more. Did the woman carry them in her arms? Did she put them in some kind of basket? Did she make any sound? I do not know. The memory is strongest in a few simple pieces. Kittens on me. Someone enters. Kittens removed. I look over. Tall woman, long dark hair. I say thanks. Sleep morning friend's mother comes through front door. I didn't do that. I was at work. That is the entire event. Everything else is interpretation. Maybe the most unsettling part is that the woman did something helpful. She did not threaten me. She did not stare at me. She did not whisper something creepy. She did not stand at the foot of the bed. She solved my problem. The kittens were keeping me awake. She removed them. That should make the experience less frightening. In some ways, it makes it stranger. If I had seen a dark figure standing in the room, I could call it a nightmare. If I had woken up unable to move, I could call it sleep paralysis. But someone quietly performing a normal household task feels different. It is almost too ordinary. The action made sense. Only the identity did not. That is why the memory stuck with me. A lot of paranormal stories involve obvious fear. Doors slam, objects move, people hear screams. This was quiet, almost gentle. Someone came in and picked up 4 kittens so a tired kid could sleep. Then left. If it was a hallucination, it was an incredibly practical one. I have wondered whether my friend's mother could have come home briefly and then gone back out. Maybe she forgot. But she seemed genuinely confused when I thanked her. She had just arrived from her night shift. There was no reason for her to lie. Also, the person I saw did not resemble her. That was the first thing I had noticed, even before knowing she had been away. Short, blonde woman. Tall, dark-haired woman. Those are not minor differences. Still, darkness can distort appearance. A short person can look taller depending on angle. Hair color can look completely different in low light. If she had been wearing something on her head, maybe I misread it. Again, possible. But she said she was not there. That explanation ends there. Could my friend have done it? Maybe. Maybe she got up, gathered the kittens, and took them away. But I knew what my friend looked like. I do not remember mistaking the woman for her. And the figure seemed adult-sized, tall enough that even through sleepy eyes I thought of a grown woman. Maybe that is just memory adding height later. I cannot prove otherwise. Another possibility is that I never saw anyone at all. Maybe I dreamed the woman. The kittens may have been real. I may have been half asleep, feeling them crawl on me. Then they eventually left. My sleeping brain created an explanation. A woman carried them away. Dream over. Morning comes. I remember the dream as something that actually happened. That explanation is strong. There is even a type of sleep-related hallucination where people can see or hear realistic things while falling asleep or waking. You can be aware of your room and still experience something that is not physically there. The figure can look completely real. Sometimes people see strangers, sometimes family members, sometimes shapes or animals. Maybe that was all this was. I was exhausted. I was in an unfamiliar bedroom. I had been repeatedly disturbed by kittens. My sleep was fragmented. That would be a perfect setup for something like that. But even if that is the explanation, one part remains interesting. The kittens were gone afterward. I did not wake up with them climbing on me again. Something changed. Maybe they left on their own. Maybe my friend moved them. Maybe they followed one another out of the room. There are plenty of ways that could happen. My brain may simply have combined the real disappearance of the kittens with the imagined woman. That is probably what a sleep specialist would say. I could accept that. I just cannot forget how normal it felt. When I remember dreams from childhood, they usually have a different texture. Events jump. Locations change. Things happen without logic. This memory has one continuous sequence. I am trying to sleep. Kittens bother me. Someone comes in. They pick up the kittens. I say thanks. I see them leave. I sleep. That is why it stayed with me. Nothing impossible happened until the next morning. I also wonder if my friend's house had any history of strange things happening. I honestly do not know. I never asked at the time. I was 12. After her mother told me she had been gone all night, I probably did not want to think about it too much. Maybe my friend had other experiences. Maybe her family had seen the tall woman. Maybe not. I do not want to invent a haunted house history where none existed. There may have been absolutely nothing unusual about the place before or after that night. Sometimes one strange event is all you get. No pattern, no explanation, just a memory. I have always been curious about the fact that I only saw the woman's back. I never saw her face. That seems common in strange sleep-related experiences, too. The brain fills in enough detail to create a person without giving you a full identity. Long hair, tall body, female shape, then gone. Maybe if I had sat up fully and turned on a light, there would have been nobody there. I will never know. At the time, I had no reason to do that. I thought she was my friend's mother. The differences in appearance were strange, but not strange enough to overcome how tired I was. I simply decided my eyes were playing tricks on me. That explanation worked perfectly until breakfast. Then the front door opened. My friend's mother came in from work. I thanked her, and she looked at me like I was speaking nonsense. That look is almost as memorable as the woman herself. Confusion, not fear, not pretending. She genuinely did not know what I meant. When she said she had been at work all night, I felt that little cold realization. Then who came into the room? I imagined 12-year-old me trying to solve it quickly. Maybe I had imagined it. That would have been the easiest answer. So I probably accepted that. Kids can be surprisingly good at pushing weird experiences aside when adults do not react strongly. If her mother had gone pale and said, "You saw her too," maybe the story would have become terrifying immediately. She did not. She was just confused. So life moved on. The kittens continued being kittens. The sleepover ended. I went home. Nothing followed me. I did not start seeing the woman again. There was no dramatic aftermath. That is probably another reason I do not claim anything paranormal happened. There was only one incident, one tired night, one figure, no proof. Still, every now and then I think about it, especially when I hear stories about people seeing someone at the edge of sleep. The memory comes back. I can picture the dim room, the blankets, tiny kittens climbing over me, the exhaustion. Then, suddenly, the relief as someone starts removing them. I turn my head. A tall, narrow figure is moving away, long, dark hair down her back. I mumble, thanks, then close my eyes. There is something almost peaceful about it. Until morning. That is what transforms it into a creepy story. The same scene with my friend's mother would be completely forgettable. A tired parent sees kittens bothering sleeping kids and removes them. Normal, kind, nothing worth remembering. Replace that parent with an unknown woman who apparently was not supposed to be in the house, and suddenly every detail feels wrong. Who was she? How did she get in? Why did she care that the kittens were bothering me? Where did she take them? Why did she never speak? Why did I not hear her leave? Again, I do not have answers. Maybe there was never anyone to answer those questions. Maybe the tall woman existed only in my half-asleep mind. That is probably the safest conclusion. But I cannot completely shake the memory because it felt physical enough that I thanked her. I reacted to someone I believed was there. I saw her, briefly, then learned the person I assumed she was had been miles away working a night shift. I think the fact that I had no fear during the experience itself makes the story stronger for me. Fear did not create the woman. At least, I was not frightened first. I was annoyed by kittens. That was my emotional state. Tired and irritated. There was no reason for my brain to invent a creepy stranger. If it invented anything, it invented someone helpful. The fear came afterward when reality no longer matched what I remembered. Maybe that is why it still gives me chills. Not because something attacked me. Not because the woman looked horrifying. She did not. She was only tall, thin, and dark-haired. It is the simple fact that she should not have been there. There is also something unsettling about how easily I accepted her presence. Had I seen a strange woman standing in the room while fully awake, I would have screamed. But because I was exhausted and assumed there was a logical explanation, I let her move around without question. I even thanked her. That tells you how powerful context is. You expect a parent. You see a human shape. Your brain says parent. Done. Only later do you realize the details never matched. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had looked at her face. Would I have recognized someone? Would there have been a face? Would the whole image have disappeared the moment I focused? Again, I am glad I did not find out. There was no reason to. I was tired. The kittens were gone. Sleep won. Looking back, I think there are 3 explanations I can live with. The first is that I had a sleep-related hallucination. That is probably the most likely. The second is that another real person entered the room, and I simply did not know who she was. Maybe a relative or someone connected to the family. The third is the one that makes the best ghost story, that there really was someone else in that house. Someone tall and thin with long, dark hair. Someone who saw 4 kittens keeping a tired child awake and decided to help. I cannot prove the third explanation. I do not claim it as fact. But it is the one my mind returns to when I think about that sleepover. Not because it was terrifying in the moment, because it was so calm. She did not scare me. She did not touch me. She did not speak. She simply took the kittens away and disappeared. And the next morning, when I thanked the only woman I thought could have done it, she looked at me and said she had only just come home from work. That was when I realized the person I had thanked in the dark was someone I could not explain.